The guy left the house and didn't believe what he saw in front of him, so he was sure that he was dreaming. He was shocked that such cute creatures could be so aggressive and held their weapons ready in front of him. The guy understood that the situation looked crazy, but the shine of the blades spoke of complete sobriety and the reality of what was happening. Before he had time to recover from the shock, he heard an appeal to himself from the side, and looked at the ground where a cute girl with elven ears was asking for help. At that moment, he finally thought that he was really dreaming about all this. A beautiful aurora borealis hung over the city. The guy was vacuuming the living room floor just as the TV news anchor announced an announcement about an aurora called Aurora. The presenter continued to talk about the wonderful phenomenon of nature and clarified that today there is an opportunity to watch it in Korea, which interested the guy, and he stopped vacuuming to look out the window. The guy looked out the window in fascination and repeated to himself the name of the aurora radiance and thought that it sounded beautiful. The dreamer thought that this was a good sign, and that it meant money that could possibly rain down on him from the sky. Mom's sharp slap on the back brought her son flying in the clouds back to the half-cleaned floor of the house. While the guy was rubbing his back after the spanking, the mother reminded her son that she told him to clean up, and he was shirking and asked him whether he fulfilled her request. The mother, having not received an answer from her son, noticed that there was a frame with a photo facing down on the shelf. She took the frame in her hands and wiped it, asking either herself or her son why the photograph fell. Mom put the frame properly on the shelf, and in it there was a photo of a very nice family, where the son was still small. The woman asked her son to quickly finish cleaning, and at that moment she would prepare something tasty to eat, to which she received consent. When the vacuum cleaner hummed again and Mom went into the kitchen, none of them noticed that the photo frame had fallen on the shelf. It was time for dinner, and mother and son decided to drink their favorite drink. They put the plates on the windowsill, opened the window, and savored their dinner while looking at the polar lights, and the son wanted to ask why his mother decided to set the table in his room. The mother, surprised by her son's question, said that his room had the best view of the lights and added that this could only be seen once in a lifetime, and she also saw in this a sign from nature itself to congratulate them on their move. The son was no less surprised and asked whether his mother really liked this house so much. Mom, continuing to look at the radiance, replied that this house holds the memory of her husband and the boy's father, which is the reason for her love for this place. The son tried to compliment his mother that she was unique and impenetrable because she was able to buy this house, to which he heard in response, so that he could choose better expressions. The mother decided to support their humorous conversation and, grabbing her son's hand with a grin, inquired about the fact that the guy had not yet outgrown puberty, and he didn't like it. Embarrassed by the burn, he kicked my mother out the door of his room, simultaneously informing her that he was going to bed, so it was better for her to leave. Resigned, my mother went to the kitchen where she saw something on the table. On the table there was an envelope whose inscription said that it contained the boy's first salary, and also a promise that he would be a good son. Mom read this and smiled, feeling proud of her son. The woman left the house and told her son that she was going on the night shift. When the boy heard this, he thought about how cool his mother was. The guy easily plopped down on the bed, happy with today, and as if confirming to the whole world, he raised his fist up and declared that from today this is truly their home. The boy was called out for the second time by a voice with a statement that now was not the time to be foolish. The sharp blades of spears and swords came almost close to the boy's face, causing him to scream. The creatures tried to tell him something, but he did not understand them. And again a voice came from the side, translating from the language of creatures to the human question: how dare human beings invade the territory of the wire-wolf ruler of this land? After hearing this, the guy concluded that he plays too many games and reads Manhwa, not believing that there is an elf and talking dogs in front of him. One of the dogs swung his sword, speaking in a still incomprehensible language, but the elf immediately translated it and said that all human beings who arrived on their land would be executed. The guy, not understanding anything, could only ask the question what it meant and continue to stand, dumbfounded. He miraculously managed to dodge the blow of the sword, but the wave from this blow still threw him towards the door of the house. The guy saw that the blow of the sword fell on the wall of the house, and a crack formed there, after which he cried out to the dogs what they were doing. One of the dogs again shouted something incomprehensible, and at that moment all three warriors rushed at the guy, and the elf only managed to translate what they said, nothing personal. The boy realized that this was already real, and he should run away. Running into the house, he shouted that how could this be an attack not related to a personal relationship, and the dogs, sweeping away everything in their path with weapons, almost caught up with the guy. And while the boy was screaming and calling out to his mother for help, the dogs at that time were chasing the one they wanted to kill at breakneck speed and shouting something. And the parallel translation of the elf said that he should not run away and meet his death with honor. Running to the open window, the guy shouted that he didn't understand what other death we were talking about, and that such cruel words could not be translated. The elf still continued to lie on the ground, stuck under the facade of the house. But then she saw the guy running out of the window, which surprised her very much. The boy only managed to shout out, and immediately landed hard with his whole body on the ground. Following him, one of the dogs flew out, breaking the window frames and glass. While flying, he raised his sword above his head with a scream. The guy saw this and screamed in horror while continuing to lie on the ground. His whole life flashed before his eyes, because it's not every day that a dog flies at you with a weapon. And so the dog delivers his fatal blow, but a defense forms over the guy. Sparks ran through the dog's body from this protection, and he could not understand what it was. The guy looked in front of him and met the dog's gaze, also perplexed. The defense, like a shock wave, threw the dog a very long distance from the person. It was like an explosion, because the rest of the guards were also thrown back, and even the elf had to cover her head with her hands. The blow was so strong that one of the warriors' uniform was shattered into pieces. The guy was shocked by what he saw, because he was able to repel the attackers without doing anything, and the dog was thrown to the ground like a pebble being floated on water. The blow was destructive and fatal, but the house remained standing in place. The guy tried to catch his breath and asked the elf what happened, to which he received the answer that she herself did not understand. The elf looked up at the shadow that hung over them and turned pale. The guy saw the reaction, but couldn't understand what was going on. The boy felt something dripping on his head, and he heard a terrible voice that asked who dared to disturb his peace. When the boy turned his face, he saw in front of him the largest and sharpest teeth from which saliva was dripping. With the speed of the wind, the guy found himself at the wall of the house next to the elf, and with horror in his voice asked whose territory this was, to which she, as if nothing had happened, began to explain to him that initially the land belonged to kobolds. The guy realized that this was not all the information, and the elf said that she heard how a wire wolf invaded here not long ago, and now he is the owner of these lands, and pointed with his hand at a creepy monster the size of a house. One of the dogs ran up to the wolf, raising his fist and shouting something in his own language, to which the wolf growled angrily and warned these damned kobolds not to disturb his sleep. The wolf crushed this kobold with his huge paw and shouted with rage that how could they justify themselves that, being hunters, they could not catch one person. The second kobold ran to the aid of his comrade, and the third, rising to one knee after a defensive blow, growled angrily. The guy, sitting on the ground, grabbed his head and shouted to himself what he should do, and as soon as the elf said that even if he asked her, the roar of a wolf interrupted their conversation. The wolf was furious that this dirty little man dared to step into his forest, and the smell of this same man was disgusting to him. Pressing the kobold even harder, he yelled that those were useless creatures. The wolf was annoyed that the kobold was screaming because he was in pain and, shouting, "Shut up," raised his huge paw over him. The kobold only managed to scream and cover his head with his hands. But the wolf's paw couldn't go all the way down because the main kobold managed to run up and hold it. The guy and the elf were amazed at what they saw. Holding the wolf's paw with all his might, the kobold said something in his own language, looking at the guy and the elf. The guy, looking questioningly at the elf, heard that the kobold told him to quickly get out of here, and that he didn't want people to get hurt because they had nothing to do with what was happening. Without thinking twice, the boy began to run, but the elf grabbed his leg, calling on him not to abandon the one who saved his life. Meanwhile, the wolf became even more furious when he saw the tenacity and opposition of the kobolds, and threatening them with the fact that he would send them after their relatives, he waved his paw. The blow was so strong that the kobolds were crushed into the wall of the house right above the boy's head, and when they fell out of there, neither alive nor dead, the guy grabbed his head and screamed that his house had been damaged again. Leaning with his fist towards the main kobold, the guy shouted to him that if they decided to fight, then let them do it properly. The kobold answered him in his own language and slammed his fist against the guy's outstretched fist. The elf translated to the guy that the kobold said victory would be possible with the strength of the young man. The guy didn't believe what he heard because he didn't even understand what kind of power it was and where he got it from. With incredible force, the wolf swung at the man, shouting that he would regret stepping on his land. The guy was again dumbfounded, looking at how a huge wild dog was moving towards him. At this moment, the man's eyes acquired a bright shine, as if something inside had turned on due to a sense of danger. The guy seemed to feel the power that his home fueled in him. The wolf saw in front of him something that caused him bewilderment, and this time the elf couldn't believe her eyes whether this was possible. A stream of light and incredible power began to emanate from the house and the guy, throwing sparks in different directions. This light enveloped the wolf like lightning, and he screamed without understanding what was happening. The wolf rushed towards the guy, screaming as he did, not yet suspecting what awaited him. In his eyes now, in addition to rage, one could read at the same time the fear that there was someone who was stronger than him. And the guy, as if possessed, continued to stand and radiate powerful energy. The elf's face showed horror and surprise at the same time. The boy raised his hand to meet the wolf's blow, and the energy that protected him from the kobold's blow began to sparkle. The wolf, without stopping, gathered all his furious strength into this blow. And so the wolf strikes, but his paw does not touch the man. The impact produced such a bright light that it was as if a new star had been born. The wolf is swept away by a stream of light over a very long distance, and the house, like a guard, continues to be indestructible, just like the guy. From the brightness of this blow, the elf covered her face with her hands, and the kobold could not believe what he had just seen, just as the guy himself couldn't believe it when the power stopped working. A wide ditch stretched from the house through the entire forest, where huge trees were broken, as if a meteorite had fallen. Having already repulsed the fatal blow, the newly made hero still stood with his hand out in front of him and, like a bright blue flame, radiated power. All this time, a kobold and an elf were watching him at the wall of the house, and none of them understood how this man did such a thing. The elf again turned to the guy for help, so that he could help pull her out using his strength. The guy, still under the influence of his powers, turned around in response to the request. He put his hand out in front of him with the same charge of force as before the wolf's strike. The kobold and the elf, realizing what could happen now, put out their hands and shouted to the hero so that he would simply lift the house. The guy moved towards the victims, and if it had been a dark night, he would have illuminated the entire clearing instead of the moon. He even firmly grasped the facade of the house and began to lift it. Applying a titanic effort, he screamed because although the strength helped, the body was still human, and he was able to raise the house enough so that the elf could get out. The guy froze, probably feeling that his strength was fading. One of the kobolds managed to drag the elf to a safe distance. The guy's strength left him, and, being immobilized, he began to fall. The house, like a huge box with a hum and dust, fell into place, and the guy fell to the ground without strength, and the kobolds and the elf immediately rushed to him. Opening his eyes a little, the boy began to come to his senses, and since he was no longer under the influence of his powers, and reason had returned to him, he remembered the monster and jumped up screaming about the wolf. He found himself in his room on the bed, and tried to catch his breath. The guy looked around and tried to understand if it was a dream. The guy went down the stairs and stretched sweetly, concluding that he plays too many games. He continued to talk about how he had dreamed such nonsense, and at that moment, he stepped on a broken plate lying on the floor. The boy was surprised where the broken plate came from. He remembered how the kobolds were chasing him and sweeping away everything in their path, and cold fear shackled him. The guy heard some sounds outside the front door. He stood in the middle of the corridor and looked at the broken and scattered things around the house. He was overcome by an ominous feeling, and already familiar silhouettes flashed outside the window. The boy approached the door and, holding the handle, began to open the doors, still not understanding whether it was a dream or not. In the bright daylight, the elf greeted him with a smile, glad that the man had woken up. The guy couldn't utter a word because he realized that everything he experienced was for real. The kobolds were rushing around, cleaning and running with bags, and the elf approached the hero and said that she was worried because he had been sleeping all day. The elf said that the eyeballs of a wolf are a valuable magical ingredient, and she prepared one for the hero, and then handed the guy a huge yellow hot ball in her hands. Nearby there were bags filled to the brim with something red, and when the elf said that the pancreas is also used for making potions, and they managed to save it, the guy was chilled to the marrow of his bones. He fell to the ground in horror, and the elf did not understand what frightened him so much. The man realized that everyone he saw and the remains of the wolf were real. Where recently the guy himself was cleaning, the kobolds were wielding a vacuum cleaner at full speed, and the hero stood angry and watched them. The angry guy silently approached the vase of flowers to check its safety. Although the vase seemed intact at first, it fell into pieces in my hands. The guy was angry because he remembered how much his mother treasured this plant. He jumped onto the place where the window used to be and, in a rage, shouted questioningly to the kobold about how they were going to fix what they had done to the house. The elf and the chief of the kobolds were sitting on their knees on the ground with their hands raised. The hero stood in front of the dog and the elf, and looked at the ditch that was formed after the destruction of the wolf. The guy looked at his hand, and again could not believe that everything was not a dream, and even more he could not believe what he had done to the wolf. The elf sat on the ground still holding the monster's eyeball in her hands, and was glad that it was not damaged. The guy came closer and pointed out that although he didn't believe it, he still wanted to understand whether the elf was really in front of him, which shocked the creature, which immediately brought its sharp ears to the argument. The elf didn't like the fact that they didn't believe in her or her, and the guy meanwhile lowered himself and asked the dog if he was a so-called kobold and touched his nose. The elf translated the kobold's furious and proud statement as saying that they really are who they are, and that they are direct descendants of Siberian huskies and some mixed-breed dogs, and she introduced herself as an elf named Moo. The guy put his hand to his face from the delirium of the situation, and thought that because of the games he had probably really gone crazy, but still asked how Moo ended up under his house. Moo remembered that she actually went into the forest to pray at the World Tree, and having received a question about misunderstanding what kind of tree this was, the elf told the man a story about the gods of the West and East maintaining all forces in balance in this world, and the tree that they created appears once every 1,000 years, and all creatures come to it to pray. The elf also came to pray, but when she was there, suddenly a house fell from the sky, and she found herself under it. The guy was confused because people usually die instantly from this. The kobold tore the boy from his thoughts by presenting him with a sword and again said something in his language. The elf translated the kobold's message that their lands were captured by a wire wolf, from which they lived in fear, and therefore, as a sign of gratitude and a request for forgiveness for almost being killed, he asked the hero to accept this sword as a gift and promised that he would serve him. Moo came close and asked if she could also join them for a while, until she found the World Tree. Moo and the kobold looked with great hope at their hero. The man crossed his arms and responded with a refusal and a desire to return home. The guy was confused because when he opened the door of the house, he found himself in another world. He was thinking about a way to return back, because the house here concerns not only him, but also his mother. The man shouted at the kobolds because they were hammering too loudly while repairing the house, and did not allow him to concentrate. The young man voiced to Mu and the kobold that it was too noisy for him here. The hero ordered the house to be repaired before his return and, not paying attention to Mu's question where he was going, left them. Mu, as if not paying attention to what the guy said, asked if they could go with the man. The guy turned around and again refused and also added that they should disappear before he arrived. He warned that he would not repeat it and said to get lost. Mu said that the kobold might already give up, but he wasn't going to. The kobold confidently said something to the elf in his language. Mu was surprised and asked if what the kobold said was true. The kobold answered and, together with Mu, looked at the hero leaving in the distance. The guy walked through the forest and thought about what he needed to do and realized that all his thoughts were connected with games where he had to either fight or save. Thoughts swarmed in his head due to the fact that the game was too real at the moment. The boy thought that his mother was probably very scared. His mother's words surfaced in his memory that she took out a loan for 20 years, but thanks to the fact that her son was nearby, it would be easier for her. And he remembered how his mother said that she liked this house. The guy imagined his mother standing in shock in the place where their house was. In order to drown out this stream of thoughts, he shouted to himself that if he got here, then there was a way to get back. The young man looked at his hand again and tried to understand what he needed to do to gain strength. Realizing how stupid it looked from the outside, he made an attempt and said for the fire to come out. A huge stream of yellow flame flared up on his hand, which terrified the hero. The guy couldn't believe it happened so quickly, but the fire gradually died down, releasing small sparks into the sky. The guy assumed that he was not yet used to this power. The fire went out completely, and the man concluded that his head was unable to work, so he decided to return home. The boy wondered if he had wandered too far, but he realized that he felt a different atmosphere. The guy stopped in time when he heard some kind of sound, and it was a pity. A bright drop was descending right in front of him from somewhere above, but the man had not yet noticed it. He stared at the ground, which glowed as brightly as the drop. The guy was numb and had no idea what to do. Above his head hung an unreal-sized spider whose eyes shone like lights. The boy raised his head and, in a state of shock, smiled slightly, realizing that there was another monster in front of him. The spider turned towards the future victim and opened its creepy mouth, drooling. And when the saliva fell on the guy's jacket, he heard a hissing and felt a burning sensation. The boy instantly took off his jacket, realizing that the clothes were dissolving from the saliva, and at that moment the spider jumped to the ground. The man, realizing that the danger was right behind him, turned around. The spider was so huge that the impact of its paw broke the tree like a straw. The monster opened its huge mouth full of fangs and growled. The guy again came face to face with a danger that was 10 times greater than him. But he remembered in time about his strength, which he had already tried to use. The hero stood in front of the spider and extended his hand forward, telling the monster that he had already killed the huge wolf. The guy screamed and a bright fiery light appeared from his hand. Imagine his disappointment when, instead of a huge stream of energy, a light smoke came out of his hand. The guy looked at his hand and didn't understand why it didn't work out, but instead of fire, sweat flowed down his hand and face from fear and excitement. Judging by the spider's wrinkled face, he became even more angry. The monster, terribly hooting with its paws, grouped its entire body and released a huge thread of web at the boy. The spider clearly hit its victim, tying its legs like a mummy. The guy tried to pull the web off himself, but it turned out to be tightly strong, and in the meantime, some bright dots were visible in the forest darkness. The boy directed his gaze exactly where the bright lights were. In the blink of an eye, there were an order of magnitude more bright dots. These bright lights became black lumps that moved sharply towards the person. These were tiny spider children, but there were a huge number of them, and they were like a blanket crawling over the guy. The boy coughed and tried to get out, crying out for help, but the black wave almost completely covered him. Only the hand that the boy was still trying to keep raised remained visible. All the guy managed to do was remember his mother and imagine her in front of him. In the midst of the impenetrable darkness, a bright spark of light suddenly appeared. The loud word Arif sounded, and a flame flashed which forced the spider to retreat. The spider was burned by the flames and therefore, having made one jump, he returned to the top. From the guy who was screaming, waving his arms and legs, black lumps ran away in different directions. Mew stood holding her hands in a magic symbol and asked if the person was okay. The elf took him by the hand and helped him up, and the guy, trying to catch his breath, thanked her for saving him and learned that it was the giant arachnid monster Arachne, who has dominated this forest for a long time. The guy was angry that it turned out that Mu knew all this time, but didn't tell him anything. The elf, in turn, said that she remembered about this recently and immediately ran after the man. The boy asked Mai that it turns out she knows how to defeat the monster, and the elf assured the man that the spider actually kills only when it is hungry. At that very moment, the monster was again right in front of them, and opened its eerie huge mouth in a roar, which confirmed Mu's words about hunger. A black wave of living lumps was approaching them, and the guy panicked and shouted at Mai to do something. Mu shouted out this time, "Aqua," and released a stream of water, but this did not become an obstacle for the spiders, and they, as if on the crest of a wave, set off towards Mu and the guy. Mu ran next to the guy and shouted that she was still just learning magic, and now she didn't know what to do, to which the man replied that he certainly didn't know because it was his first time in their world. Suddenly the guy disappeared, leaving behind a bright light like the first time. Mu stopped and was dumbfounded, trying to find the man. A spider's paw appeared right in front of the elf, which she did not expect at all. Mu, trembling with fear, turned to the huge monster. The elf, in a trembling voice, asked the spider if they could solve everything by talking. Meanwhile, in that clearing in the middle of the forest where the house stood, a scream was heard. The kobolds were still cleaning up in front of the house, and they were shaken by some force that was emitting the same bright light. This light and shock wave came from the teleportation of a guy from the forest to his room, where he landed not so softly. The young man ran out of the room in torn clothes, screaming about the spider and trying to figure out where the elf was. As soon as the guy voiced his thoughts, a bright light shone and pulled him back into the room like a magnet. Following the boy, the door closed with a loud knock. The house shone again with that same bright blue color. The kobolds stood in front of the house and did not understand what was happening. Arachne appeared behind them. The guy stood in the room and frantically pulled the handle trying to open the door, and also could not understand what kind of radiance it was. He couldn't help but wonder if Mu was okay, and he hoped that she was able to move the same way. The guy heard screams outside the window, and saw a spider there with which the kobolds were already fighting. The kobolds attacked the spider with weapons, and Mu was tied to the Arachne on one of her paws. The guy saw Mu and cursed because his suspicions about the worst were confirmed. The boy stood in the room and felt that his legs were shaking, and could not believe that it was from fear because this was not typical for him. The chief of the kobolds rushed into battle again, holding a sword in front of him. The spider spewed acid at the kobold, but he was able to fight off the flow of deadly liquid with the help of his sword. The acid hit the wall of the house, and the guy saw it from the window of his room, and he again screamed that these creatures were destroying his house, which would cause trouble for the young man when his mother saw all this. The guy shouted to the main kobold, who was already tied up in a web, to stop fooling around and put an end to this insect. The guy grabbed a chair and shouted at the window to open. He threw a chair at the window, but instead of breaking the glass, the chair jumped back like a toy. The guy fell to the floor against the wall in shock and didn't understand why he couldn't get out of here, and he got the impression that the house was protecting him. The boy had the feeling that the house seemed to have a mind. The guy tried to admit this thought, which plunged him into thought, as if separating him into darkness from everything that was happening. Meanwhile, outside the house was almost completely blackened by Arachne's children. The guy, as if communicating with the house, was glad that he was safe here and that he actually had nothing to do outside, which made his soul feel better, and he thanked the house, hoping that everything would disappear soon. The guy didn't believe what he just said to himself, which is why he hit his head against the wall. He felt disgusted with himself because he was glad to remain on the sidelines, and again asked the question whether the house was connected with that incredible power. All the kobolds were connected by webs, and moved under the house, as if on a black wave. The guy continued to remember the moments when the house was functioning, but there was no electricity, and it dawned on him that it was not he who received the power, but his house. Arachne jumped onto the roof of the house, growling ferociously. The guy realized that the monster was not giving up, and did not want to die without doing anything. He gathered all his strength into a fist, and accepted the fact that everyone he saw was real. The guy said that if the house really has intelligence, then let him help him. He stood in the middle of the room, and shouted for the house to open the door for him now. The light coming from the house lifted the spider above the roof, and after that, like the wolf last time, he threw away Arachne and his children with a powerful stream. The spider landed on the ground in front of the house, as if a helicopter had landed and kicked up dust. Power emanated from the house, like a bright blue flame. Arachne was furious, and showed it with all her being. The radiance no longer began to emanate from the entire house, but focused on the front door. The door opened slightly, and a human leg was visible from there. It was a guy, and just like the last time with the wolf, he now also radiated powerful energy. The guy was determined because the protection of both creatures and the house depended on him. The hero threatened to kill the spider if he did not want to know his strength. Arachne, emitting an eerie hiss, called on her children as an army. The monster attacked and, while jumping, throwing out a web, roared furiously. The hero, flashing lightning, was able to fight off the web and the children of Arachne, who were already close. The guy jumped away from the web towards the monster, and as if he had a sharp blade instead of a hand, it cut the web and freed Mu. The main kobold saw what the hero did and shouted something to him. The guy, holding Mu in his arms, who had just woken up, went down to the ground. Mu was weak and scared, and could hardly believe what she saw. After all, before her there really was the face of a real hero. This time, in addition to the bright lightning, there was a shield around the guy that the spider could not break through. The spider lashed with terrible force with its web, as if hitting a shield with a baton, but this did not change anything. The monster, attacking, used its paws, but the hero was unshakable and stood straight and calm under the shield. The guide looked at the spider. With confidence in his voice, he asked if this was all that he was capable of. Arachne was angered by this man's arrogant confidence, and she sent her black army of children against him. Without much effort, the guy, in the blink of an eye, found himself on the roof of the house with one jump. The guy shouted that now it was his turn to strike, and 2 flames appeared from his hands. He screamed and directed streams of fire directly at Arachne and her children. Like fiery fireworks, the guy deftly threw fireballs at the monster one after another. The spider took the hot blows on itself, thereby covering the children with its body. The guy was incredibly shocked and did not believe that his family had such powerful power. And if the last time he fought with a wolf, he didn't remember anything, now he feels the power in full. In the midst of these thoughts, right in front of the guy above the house, and Arachne appeared in a deadly leap and pointed her 2 knife-sharp front paws at him. The man manages to grab one of the monster's paws right above his head, preventing him from killing himself. The hero threw the spider to the ground with terrible force, as if a plane had dropped a bomb, and shouted that it should not come near his house. The guy, unlike his enemy, softly descended to the ground among the clouds of dust that had not yet settled down after such a strong blow. Arachne took a defensive position, and the man threateningly asked if the monster would like to try to fight again. The spider, from an unprecedented size, increased several times more, like a ball, causing veins and veins to appear on the body. The monster hissed furiously, and exhaled from its mouth air the same color as its poisonous saliva. Moose shouted that this was a poisonous fog and everyone needed to hold their breath, which the kobolds immediately did, and because such a thick fog suddenly covered them, and nothing was visible, Mu called out to the man to understand where he was. Among the foggy curtain, the silhouette stood still calmly and confidently. A huge shadow jumped over the hero with lightning speed but very blurry. Like the tail of a comet or a sun-colored katana, the poisonous fog was cut through by a web. The hero looked at this deadly thread, which passed so close to him that it cut the bridge of his nose and carried away drops of blood with the force of the wind. If it weren't for the force, the guy would no longer be alive. But he continued to stand with an iron grip. And then a sudden and fatal blow was dealt directly to him. The hero, without even looking, simply raised his hands up to receive the blow of his enemy. His palms clasped together, emitting a bright light as if he had caught the sun itself. The fog divided into two parts, and in the middle of these two walls, the hero could be seen holding the spider's paw above his head. Mu and the kobolds were shocked by what they saw in front of them. Arachne growled and tried to escape from the man's hands, but the grip was dead. With an evil grin, the guy told the monster right in the face that he had managed to dispel the wind, and now he would show everything he was capable of. He held the monster's paw with one hand and pointed the other at it, and was already preparing to strike to finish everything. But Mu rushed forward and shouted that the fight must be stopped. The man was surprised and argued that the monster was the first to attack them, so all that remained was to finish what he started. Mu told the guy the opposite, that in fact they started first. The elf explained that before she lost consciousness she saw something, namely, that because of their fight with the wolf, the little spiders lost their homes. The guy let go of the spider's paw and looked back in bewilderment. He pointed to a very long ditch leading to the forest, and asked if he really did it. Mu stood under Arachne, and had one of the cubs on her shoulder, and she answered the man that it was him, which is why the nest was destroyed, and all the food collected by the mother spider was burned. Mu was very close to nature and brought forward the facts that these creatures would not harm others without reason. And since the shelter was destroyed, and before that a wolf attacked and ate all the supplies, the spiders were hungry and really tried to eat them. And after what the elf said, the guy realized that the anger of these creatures was justified because, although he was under the influence of force, he destroyed their house. The spider was still angry, so he slammed his paw on the ground, almost crushing the kobolds and Mu. The elf hid behind the man, and the kobold stood in front of the two of them and held a sword. The guy turned to the spider, asking for forgiveness, and said that he understood his feelings and offered to attack the spider until his anger subsided. But the boy refused to die. Arachne hissed her condition, which Mu translated as a desire to eat the kobold and the elf, and only then would she forgive them all. And Mu was happy at first, but then realized that she had just translated. The guy gave his consent without hesitation, which made Mu shocked that this man was so bad. But the young man did not react to the words of the frightened elf, and continued with a question to the monster that only these two bodies would be enough for all of them. And for the first time in recent times, in the clearing where the house stood, both sides negotiated and did not destroy each other. The kobolds had a lot of trouble, but they dug up the hidden meat of a wire wolf, which would have been enough to keep the spiders alive for a whole month. The guy gave the spider a great opportunity and asked whether this fresh product, which was prepared just yesterday, would be enough. If you don't look underneath, you might get the impression that the meat came to life and went into the forest on its own, but these were the happy black spiderlings who dragged their supplies home. The army of black lumps followed their mother towards the forest, and the brave teen waved after them. The guy collapsed to the ground and exhaled with relief, and said that it was good that everything was over. The kobold showed a thumbs up, and Mu leaned over with a smile to the hero, confirming that everything turned out really well. But despite the smiles and joy, the guy felt some kind of tension. And somewhere far away, in the middle of a huge amount of water, on a stone island, one could see the silhouette of a large uprooted tree. The house had grown together with the tree in a stranglehold, as if it were part of a mighty plant. A strange creature looked out of one of the windows, resembling an alien in blue clothes, and its head was a brain in a transparent ball of liquid, and it looked somewhere into the distance through a telescope. What this creature saw through the telescope made him break loose and run through a long corridor in which large plush toys were sitting. The alien ran into a spacious hall where, in the darkness, only a throne was illuminated, next to which sat someone who looked like a man, and that creature turned to him as if he were Mr. Demon with some news about the World Tree. A little boy in pajamas sat next to the throne, and was building something like a tower out of cubes. The boy did not react to the servant's words, and continued to build a turret on which several cubes had already lost their balance and began to fall. The servant continued to report to his master that in any case they had sent a spy on his instructions. It was as if on the screen Mu was seen along with the hero and the kobold, and how they were walking towards the house, and the servant added that by this moment there was probably already information about the location of the tree. The little demon placed the last cube on the tower, and it completely fell down. After the tower collapsed, the boy turned his attention to the servant, fixing his gaze on him. Something small exploded in the sky, and the hero, who was standing at that moment on the roof of the house, covering his face with his hand because the sun was shining brightly, looked up and could not understand whether he had hit something. The guy saw the feathers flying down and realized that he had hit the bird in the sky. The young man jumped from the roof to the ground and saw that some kind of branch was sticking out from under the house, from which a glow was also emanating. The man continued to look at the plant, observing its flickering, and thought that it looked strange. The hero with a sharp movement pulled out a branch from under the foundation, thereby making a decision for himself that he should clean around the house every day. And after that he immediately began practicing his skills, and to begin with, he shouted out the command for the pillar of fire, and it instantly appeared. The guy decided to check how powerful his power would be if he moved away from the house. And after moving 10 meters away, the fire almost went out. Having made another attempt to cause fire, the hero did not succeed, no matter how hard he tried. The young man looked towards the house, and repeated to himself that he had moved exactly 10 meters away from the place of power, and wondered if it was possible that if he moved a long distance away from the house, he would not be able to use magic. And then a moment came to mind of how he stood in the spider forest and could not cause a fire, and if he had known, he would have simply taken his feet from there. The man lay down on the ground and swore that the situation was too tough and he wouldn't be able to find a way to return home, given the fact that he was a real recluse. In the distance, the voices of Mu and the kobold were heard. They were approaching the guy, shouting if he was all right, and while they were running, the hero thought that he should not tell them about the problem that had arisen. He took out a phone with a photo of him and his mother on the wallpaper, looked at it, and realized that he was bored, and he was also surprised by the inaccessibility of communication. Although all the equipment was working, despite the clear day, something shone in the sky like a star, and it was hard not to notice. Because of the sunlight, the guy had to put his hand to his face in order to see that flash in the sky. But along with the flash, a creature very similar to a cat, and with a red cloak on its back was already rushing towards him, screaming. Mu ran up just when the cat was almost attacking the man's face. The elf grabbed the cat by the tail, and began to pull it away from the hero, while he screamed from not understanding what or who it was. And Mu still managed to turn the creature's attention to herself, but she had to cover her face with her hands as the animal fiercely attacked her with its claws. But the most terrible thing was that the cat caught the elf's ear. The creature was furious and waving its paws while already in the hands of a man and, moreover, shouted something in its own language, not paying attention to the fact that the guy asked to calm down and asked where he came from. Poor Mai was all scratched up and at the same time asked the man if everything was okay with him, to which he replied that yes, but pointed to the elf's ear. Mu didn't understand what the guy was talking about until she looked at her ear, which instead of being sharp became human-like. She was so terrified that she did not notice the disappearance in front of her and, screaming, tried to cover her ears with her hands. The guy, dumbfounded by what was happening, no longer even noticed the mysterious guest who was biting his hands, but only stared at Mu, who picked up her ear and turned away from them with a feeling of shame, asking if everyone had seen what happened. Mu realized that explanations could not be avoided and began her story with a description of a city that was located among the mountains, and its inhabitants lived in houses that had grown together with the trees. The most important part of the city was considered a huge multi-story building with sharp roofs, which was also intertwined with a tree trunk. One day, an explosion occurred in the large library of this house. As it turned out, it was Mu who was conducting experiments and made the mistake of believing that she could put all the lizard's eyes into the potion. 3 elves ran into the room, covering their noses with scarves from the terrible stench, and taking into account the order to immediately open the windows of one of the elves. She was the main one. The main elf turned to Mrs. Mu with a question of what was happening here, to which the experimenter, embarrassed and burning with shame, could only begin her explanation. Mai was interrupted by the main elf, and said that they could no longer bear it, and, pointing to the exit, told her to get out of here. Mu apologized and left the library behind the doors, of which they immediately began to whisper gossip about her, about what she had done again, and what she supposedly lengthened her ears about. Mu walked along the corridor among other elves with tears in her eyes, and heard that everyone already knew about the similarity of the ears of the princess of the Elven Kingdom to human ones, and about the rumors that she was a human, and therefore the queen and her husband the duke were also under suspicion. But the princess continued to walk on without noticing that she had dropped something. Someone picked up a sharp false elf ear from the floor, and shouted so that Princess Mu would not forget what belonged to her. Mu, barely holding back her tears, turned to the one who called her. The red-haired elf, who wanted to give the ear to the princess, had it snatched from his hands by another elf. He laughed and pointed out that even the princess's ears were fake, and called her a fake and a crybaby. Mu shouted that she was a real elf, and heard in response that real elves cannot have such short ears, and the elf again called her a fake who pretends to be an elf with the help of fake ears. The red-haired elf took back the princess's ear from the hands of the bully. He pointed out to the rude people that they themselves are not real elves, since they believe that only ears are an indicator of belonging to their race. Mai stood motionless in front of the red-haired elf, and, without taking away her ear, she told him no, which forced the elf to ask her again what she meant. The princess shouted the word no, and pushed the elf towards the steps. She was scared and confused, from which tears and large drops were already ready to break and float down her face. Mu ran to the end of the corridor, hearing exclamations behind her about how rude she was, and the elf, who wanted to help, sat on the floor angry from not understanding what happened. Among the dense forest stood a beautiful house with a clay roof, and birds were flying over it, and it was in this house that the princess lived, whom her mother, the queen, tried to call by knocking on the door and calling her full name Reina Mu Akalister. The queen pointed out to her daughter that she knew about her whereabouts, and that she should immediately get out of there, while the duke stood nearby and tried to persuade his wife not to do what she had planned. The queen immediately ordered her husband to be silent, citing the argument that 50 years had already passed, and they could no longer give their daughter permission, and perhaps the duke agreed, but still did not understand why such suddenness. Their daughter appeared in front of her parents with the same tears in her eyes. Now the queen decided to directly discuss with her daughter whether she remembers that it is already the 50th year, and now she will not be able to refuse the trip, and asked Mu how much time had passed since the elders sent on the journey. Mu gave an answer to her mother about the past 50 years, and the queen indicated that she believed that during this time her daughter would be able to become a real elf. The mother, as if blessing her child for the journey, said that there was no point in waiting for anything, so tomorrow night, when the third moon intersects with the second moon, she will have to leave this place and hit the road. Father and daughter were shocked by what they heard, but no matter how they begged, the queen was adamant in her decision. But at the same time she expressed her hope that Mu would learn something useful from her journey, become a real elf, and return home unharmed. Mu sat sad again with tears, and held the eyeball of a wolf in her hands, leaning on the door of the house in front of the kobold and the guy, saying that this is how she ended up here, and now she will wander for 50 years. The guy held the uninvited ferocious guest under the flask and briefly indicated that Mai was kicked out of the house, to which the princess shouted that she had gone on a trip and not what he said. The man asked what would happen if Mu did not find the world tree, to which she replied that it was not difficult, and even if the hero did not help her, she could cope alone. For the guy, the last straw was that he was called Mr. Man, so he said his name Kong Nam and still heard Mr. Kong Nam. Ken asked Mu about the desire that the tree can make, and if this is true, how many of these desires are there? And the princess said that the tree is really capable of doing anything. From the good news, Ken became joyful and, continuing to keep his foot on the flask with the ferocious creature, said that the elf and kobolds could stay here. But then the guy voiced a condition, namely that they could stay until they found the world tree. Mew agreed with this, but pointing questioningly at her ear, she wanted no one to find out her secret. And Ken immediately understood this, convincing the princess that he would keep her secret, and also told the kobold to keep his mouth shut. And while the team was having a conversation, one of the kobolds ran towards them. The kobold stopped and waved his paw indicating that he wanted to show them something. Ken picked up the flask with the beast in his hands, and all three looked questioningly at the kobold. The kobold led them to one of the walls of the house, near which someone's legs were sticking out of an earthen pit, and were also moving. Ken was surprised that he saw the lower part of the body also human, and not some kind of monster, and an animal jumped out of his hands with a burn. The animal tried to dig up the body, but was too small for this. Ken could not look at how this little one was suffering, so he commanded the rodent to move away and easily pulled the body out by the leg, and the animal began to hit the guy on the leg, apparently protecting the one who was pulled out of the ground. This was a man who, judging by his appearance, not only had been underground for a long time, but also most likely landed unsuccessfully. But despite his shabby appearance, the man woke up by opening his eyes. An unknown person attempted to strike Kanu while performing a somersault. Khan was confused but immediately defended himself with his hands from the blow. The enemy, looking at his victim, was clearly surprised by what happened no less than Khan. Although Ken was essentially in danger, he still asked who was in front of him. The guy did not hear the answer to his question about who he saved and was again forced to take a stance to protect himself from the attacker. And due to the strength of the house, Ken again did not receive damage from the attacker. Ken remembered that being near the house no force acts on him. But despite the privilege of protection, the guy tried to find out where this man was taught to attack his savior. And while Ken was talking, the one he saved was already holding a sharp throwing weapon at the ready. With a deft wave of his hand, this warrior threw sharp blades straight at Ken. Considering the fact of defense, these blades flew away from Ken as if he were not a living person, but a wall. The one who threw the weapon could not believe his eyes. Fire appeared on Ken's hand, and he said that he wanted to forgive the warrior because he was still young. And at the moment when this unknown person got angry, pointing out to Ken that he thought too much of himself, a look appeared in the darkness that was directed straight at the robber. Ken saw the body fall to the ground again, like a dead weight, and did not understand what was happening. Mew ran up to the fallen body, asking if everything was okay, and Ken, in his defense, shouted that he actually didn't do anything. The elf shouted that she couldn't feel her heartbeat. Ken, in hysterics, asked Mu to double-check and continued to say that he had not laid a finger on this man. The guy got so nervous that he began to crush the kobold's head, which made him stop seeing anything. The animal ran around the owner trying to bring him to his senses, and he succeeded because Mai heard, albeit a heavy breath. So she immediately loudly announced that the person was alive, and that it was a girl, and although Ken heard, he continued to squeeze the kobold's muzzle and repeated Mai's words that no heartbeat. The animal ran fussily from one Mai shoulder to the other asking for help, but the princess, although she understood that something needed to be done, did not know what. Ken picked up his enemy, surprising Mu and angering the beast. The beast rushed at the guy's head and bit him, but Ken said that he would help, so he asked the rodent to calm down. Ken, carrying the girl in his arms, moved towards the house, and the rest followed him. In the room, near the bed in which the girl lay, Kan and the kobold stood, and Mai sat down next to her, waiting with everyone. The victim had a wet bandage on her head, and an animal was sitting on top of her, clutching the blanket, worried about her owner, and Mai, just in case, decided to check her pulse, which made her scared because she didn't feel it. But at the same time, the princess said that she could hear the girl's breathing, from which everyone exhaled with relief, and Kan said that this was an indicator of life. Then Mew decided, just in case, to check her heartbeat, which also made her scared and scared everyone because she didn't hear the beat. Kan could not stand this and hysterically asked Mu whether the girl was still alive or not, to which the princess repeated that she did not know, because there was breathing but the heart could not be heard. The hero concluded for himself that there can be no place for common sense in this world. So perhaps what happened now is in the order of things. The guy approached the girl at the same time turning to Mew with a question about healing magic, but the princess, as it turned out, had not yet learned this, and the animal hissed when it saw the enemy. Kong took the little animal in his hands, and was surprised that he hissed at him, and then said that they should be grateful to him for allowing them to stay in his mother's room, after which Mew asked if Mr. Kong Nam really had a mother. Kan asked Mu a counter question. Isn't it obvious that he has a mother, but now she is absent? And when the guy saw the princess's interest in this, he suggested talking on the street. The girl remained lying in bed, breathing heavily, and next to her was her faithful animal. Perhaps because of the intense heat, the girl was mentally transported to the place where she was from and, standing on a mountain ledge, she heard someone calling her, saying the word sister. The girl heard the word sister again, and the voice came closer and closer, which made her turn around. A sweet girl with two thick ash-pink braids and a simple robe, and with a bouquet of yellow flowers in her hands, which she handed to her sister, came up to her. The stranger took the flowers, and was pleasantly surprised by their beauty. She thanked the sweet girl for knowing how to make her heart beat faster and stroked her head. The girl with braids asked the stranger why her heart was beating, and she repeated the flowers, but could not finish the answer. After all, the dear sister interrupted her by saying that this was a strange fact about her heart, and replacing her sweet likeness with a creepy essence, she said in a terrible voice that her little sister's heart couldn't beat. The stranger began to fall when she saw a gaping hole instead of her heart. The girl woke up from the nightmare because she was delirious due to the fever and took a sharp but at the same time heavy breath of air. She sat down on the bed trying to catch her breath, which was noticed by the animal, which had been faithfully waiting all this time and was now also nearby. The stranger lay back, stroking the tailed animal and, pulling up the blanket, thought about how soft it was. The girl was alerted by sounds coming from behind the door, and as if she had not just been unconscious, she turned on ninja mode and began to creep up to the door. The stranger, hanging from the ceiling, opened the door slightly to see where the sounds were coming from. In the kitchen, the microwave made the sound of finishing heating food. Kim was upset that he had to give his food to Mu and the kobolds, but they were terribly hungry. The kobolds attacked the food and the animal joined them, and Mu, with her mouth full, asked Kan how such delicious food could be in these boxes, to which the guy wanted to answer that it was called semi-finished products, but changed his mind. The guy took this opportunity to say that this delicious food appeared thanks to his mystical divine power, and showed fire in his hand. Mew took one of the dishes, and asked what it was called, to which Kan said that it was fried pork chyapakim, and the princess could only pronounce jukbuk. The next divine food was kimchi, and Kong clarified that it was prepared with real Korean hands. Mew stuffed her mouth full, and the spiciness of this dish was not long in coming because the princess's face became as red as kimchi dressing, and the kobold, seeing the reaction to the food, moved his plate closer to the elf. Kan, in order to surprise everyone, again said that such a level of sharpness is a common thing for him, and the applause was not long in coming. It wasn't limited to just food, and Mia asked what was in the cup, and found out that it was coffee prepared personally by Mr. Kan. Inhaling the aroma of the drink, Mia rushed to the sink to pour out the coffee, which horrified Kana. Mia covered her mouth with her hands and voiced her suspicions that the drink was spoiled or that poison had been added to it, so even the kobold pointed his sword for defense. Ken, grinning, said that he was not surprised by their reaction, because they did not understand the delights of the taste of real coffee, and while the man was saying this, the animal tried to quietly steal the food, which attracted attention. The guy went down to the level with the animal and quietly and calmly told him not to be embarrassed and eat himself, because his mistress had also prepared food, so he shouldn't steal, especially since Ken's mother has an iron rule that there is no place for thieves in the house. Ken told the tailed beast that he did not consider him and his mistress to be thieves, and just at that moment a stranger peeked out from behind the door. Ken wanted to discuss with the beast what kind of girl was lying in that room and what she was doing near his house. The beast spoke to the kobold and the kobold to the elf, and she, in turn, translated the beast's answer as a refusal of information since it was a secret. The kobold attempted a dialogue, but the furry animal shook its paws and shouted that it would never tell this. Ken got angry because all these different languages confused him along with the translation at once and gave the beast the argument that he had fed them, so the fluffy could have shared information instead of denying. Unexpectedly for everyone, instead of the animal, the stranger herself answered that she was looking for the world tree, and she was immediately bombarded with questions about how she was feeling and when she managed to get up. The stranger began to tell what Mookin had once said, namely about the rare appearance of a tree and the fulfillment of a wish, and Ken interrupted the girl by clarifying that everyone who was here was also looking for him. The girl jumped up and, in shock, asked if they really knew the location of the tree. Ken replied that they did not know the location of the tree, but he also needed to find it in order to return home, and in response to the stranger's counter-question that he was not at home now, Ken refused to explain everything to her. The girl sat back at the table and thought about it before saying anything. She decided to tell her story with the beast about finding the tree, and she explained that while she was looking for the tree, she felt an ominous energy that came from some unknown person. When Ken asked who the energy came from, the girl refused to answer, but the girl continued to say that suddenly, out of nowhere, a huge fiery cloud of energy appeared and knocked her down. Ken immediately understood what was going on, and Mew already started talking about what it could be, but Ken shouted, interrupting Mew and attracting everyone's attention. Ken cleared his throat and asked the girl about her search for the tree, according to her words, after which he voiced that he was very sorry because they had no idea what it looked like. And the guy pointed to Moo, arguing that even this elf, who has lived on Earth for 200 years, does not know what a tree looks like. The girl held out a scroll in her hand in gratitude for her salvation. The princess took the scroll in her hands and unfolded it, not believing that she would now see the world tree there, and Ken, not seeing what was on the scroll, also tried to look at it to see. And so the hero held the unfolded scroll in his hands and looked at it with a thoughtful look. In Ken's eyes, there was a clear lack of understanding of what he was seeing in front of him. On Ken's face, there was a silent question about what he had in his hands now, because this scroll was unusual. Instead of ancient manuscripts, a moving hologram shone brightly in his face. The stranger stood next to the guy and explained that this was a map, and it was made from the birch bark of the world's trees that had appeared earlier, and the map showed what state the tree was in now. Ken concluded from what he saw in front of him that the tree was now blazing with fire, and Mew did not believe the words, so she came up to check. The stranger with a sharp movement snatched the map from the guy's hands and said that this was impossible since the world tree cannot burn. What was her reaction to seeing the fire on the map? The stranger didn't say a word, but simply jumped away through the window, breaking it, which is why Ken was angry and shouted that it's really impossible to use the doors. And besides this, he again mentioned his irritation at the fact that everyone was trying to destroy his house. Ken ran out of the house and found the robber on the roof and asked if she was going to come down. He was outraged that how dare she climb onto someone else's house. The stranger stood on the roof and looked around, clearly trying to find the tree, and did not notice Ken's exclamations. The girl indifferently jumped from the roof to the ground and ran away. She ran away so quickly towards the forest that she left a trail of dust behind her, and Kan, watching her, wondered why she was so furiously looking for the tree. Kan had an epiphany because he remembered the tree's ability to fulfill any desire. Pictures of what this tree would look like in Mu's story about it surfaced in his imagination, and Kan imagined how this tree dies, turns black and dries up, and he completed this with a logical chain, understanding the impossibility of returning home if he did not find the tree, and he did not make a wish. From all these gloomy thoughts, Kan brought himself to a state as if he had already died. The guy's thoughts were so loud and pulled him in that he didn't notice how Mu was already standing behind him, and when he turned around he only asked what would happen to his wish if the tree died, to which he received the same answer, which he already knew, that he would not return home. Kan realized that everything was really that serious. At that time, the stranger deftly, like her animal, jumped from tree to tree in the forest and talked to her furry friend that she was sure that the tree was nearby, and if there was a fire, then there should be traces. The girl easily rose above the trees, and with confidence or hope tried to see traces of the fire. She looked around, hovering in the air, and the animal, standing on its hind legs on her shoulder, also peered into the distance. The girl looked at the dense forest from a bird's eye view and wondered to herself where the tree was. After voicing her thought, she felt terrible pain and saw a bright light shine where the bandage was. The girl lost her strength and, like a stone, began to fall down, and the animal followed her. The impact on the ground was strong and clouds of dust rose from it. The stranger lay in a huge crater, covering her eyes with her hands. Tears were streaming down her face, apparently from a feeling of hopelessness. Kan all this time couldn't find a place for himself because he didn't know what to do. The guy came home and saw how Mu and the kobold were gobbling up semi-finished products with appetite, and he was outraged how they could eat at such a moment. Mu, with her mouth full, said that it was difficult for her to resist such a yummy, and added that the world tree can grow again if its roots are not damaged. The sad atmosphere in the house was disrupted by the sudden return of the stranger through the other half of the window, which she also broke, just like the first one when she ran out. Kan raised his hand over the girl in whom the fire was already blazing, and she snatched the scroll from his other hand, and Mu, literally holding the hero's hot hand, asked him to calm down. The robber opened the scroll, and this time the fire was no longer burning there. Mai explained that this paper is capable of storing memories, and thus you can see everything that happened to the tree and can draw a parallel, calling it a video recorder, which Mai did not understand. The stranger, still looking at the map, screamed that she had found a tree. On the map you could see a sprout that had just emerged from the ground. The next image showed the same tree, but now grown. In the last picture, the tree had thick leaves and two human silhouettes stood next to it. Mu was surprised that the sprout was so small and indicated that it was the first time she had seen the sacred tree in such a state. And Kan at that time changed his face because he remembered that he had already seen such a weed somewhere. After the guy's thoughts, the stranger, looking further at the map, screamed at what she saw. The map showed something square falling onto a tree sprout from above, and what fell on the sprout flattened it into smithereens. And in the next image, you can see how the tree made an attempt to crawl out from under something heavy, but two human hands reached out to it. These hands grabbed the stem of the tree and uprooted it. Words cannot express what Kan felt at that moment looking at the map. Everyone who looked at the map was horrified, and Mu screamed, "Who could do this?" And only Kan stood neither alive nor dead at that moment behind them all. Kan realized that it was his house that fell on a tree sprout. He remembered how he saw a root or branch sticking out from under the foundation of a house, and pulled it out. But the creepiest thing is that Kan, calling this weed disgusting, threw it into the fire from the heat of which the kobolds warmed themselves. The guy became paler than the walls in his house from the realization of what he had done with his own hands. Kan turned to the window with broken glass with scant hope for a different scenario. The guy looked out of the window and saw how the kobolds were trampling on the very fire that had almost smoldered. he realized that among these coals lay what everyone who was now in the house was looking for. Khan was overcome by the most disgusting feeling of fear mixed with guilt and hopelessness. When the story of the tree reached its end, the map caught fire. Everyone who watched the map could not utter a word, and only Mu asked who could have committed such a disgusting act. Ken, all on his nerves, decided to ask again, maybe this is not the same Sprout, because he heard from everyone the story about the fact that the world is so strong because it created this world, and it cannot be so easily destroyed. To which Mu showed him a map burned in the middle, where the diary of the sacred tree was written. The stranger was furious, and said that she would immediately find the creature that killed the tree and destroy it. Mu asked the girl if the world tree had really been destroyed, to which the stranger replied that she didn't know, but she had to find out who did it. The kobold took the sword in his hands, and with the help of Mu, everyone heard him tell him who it was, and he would chop him into pieces. The stranger sat down in the middle of the room in the lotus position, escalating the situation with silence, and looking at everyone, the girl said that she had arrived to destroy the tree. Mu asked the stranger what she was talking about, because she couldn't believe what she heard. Kan, without thinking twice, in order to shift the focus of attention and suspicion, immediately grabbed the stranger's clothes and shouted that he had caught the criminal. The girl did not lean and did not run away, but only said that she had an order. Ken did not understand what she meant, and the girl continued that she was ordered to destroy the tree. But someone had already done it before her, and they shouted at her that she was talking nonsense and to tell the truth. The stranger explained that the tree cannot be destroyed, and Ken interrupted her by asking how something that cannot be killed could die, after which the girl continued about the vulnerability of a tree sprout in the first week of its life, and that it is no different from other plants, and in the first week of life it reserves strength so that it becomes sacred. The girl further talked about the order that she was given to destroy the sprout in order to take away the chance from all creatures. Ken pointed his finger at the stranger and said that he was right, that this girl was a criminal. But Mia asked what was meant by the words about taking away everyone's chance. The stranger, as if suffering from what she had to do, shouted that it was all because of the one who gave the order, because he wants no one to be able to destroy him by making a wish at the tree. Mu immediately asked a counter question, who controls the girl? The stranger refrained from answering and only kept her gaze on the elf. And then she looked at the guy and said that she would ask him only one thing, namely, what connects Kan and the one who gave her the order, which made him dumbfounded. Silence reigned again among everyone standing in the house. The silence was broken by a knock on the front door, and someone's voice behind it. Everyone froze looking at the door, and Kan either asked himself or others who was there. The stranger realized something for herself and exchanged glances with her animal. The girl seemed to dissolve, leaving behind only a little radiance. Kan opened the door a little, and cautiously looked out at whoever was knocking. Immediately at the threshold stood a bearded grandfather with gray hair, dressed in the style of a Viking, and behind him were three more peasants, one of whom blew a trumpet, the one in the middle sang a song, and the last one danced. Grandpa turned to Kan, greeting him as the keeper of the tree, and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and the guy did not understand at all who he was talking about. Grandpa still smiled sweetly, and asked to treat them to a glass of water. Kan went outside and asked the uninvited guests who they were. Grandpa thought about it, and asked if Kim was not the guardian of the tree, and said that the last time he was here 1,000 years ago. So he asked if the guy was a descendant of the guardian. The elder saw that Ken still did not understand what they were saying to him, raised his glasses in order to better see the young man, and asked again that since he was neither a guardian nor a descendant of a guardian, then he turned out to be a man. The three men heard Grandpa say the word man, and showed a violent reaction to it. Like savages, these three ran up to Kan and began to touch him, asking how a person could end up in a sacred place, and added the fact that people are lazy creatures. Kan was shocked that strange humanoid creatures were touching him, and began screaming to stop touching him. Judging by the way the grandfather named Hyungnam addressed the men, he was the leader among them, and he ordered them to calm down, reminding them where they were. But immediately after this, a quarrel arose between the men because they began to accuse each other of who was the first to call the man a lazy creature. Hyungnam was clearly ashamed of them, and then Mew came out of the house. The princess recognized her grandfather Dwayne in the old man, and Hyungnam, hearing someone called him, turned towards a familiar voice. Mew ran up to celebrate and hug her grandfather, and he was also happy to see her. The princess did not pay attention to Kana's questions, introduced herself properly, with one hand holding the amulet around her neck and holding the cloak with the other. She announced that she was the third child of the Queen of the Green Forest, Mu Akalister, welcoming Master Dwayne the Dwarf King. Dwayne emphasized that a lot of time had passed and Mew had grown a lot, to which the princess replied that Grandpa, on the contrary, had not changed at all, and Ken at that time was looking at Hyungnam, not believing that in front of him was a real dwarf. Like thunder in broad daylight, the loud blow of a massive hammer rang out. All the same three dwarves examined what they hit with a hammer, criticizing the terrible choice of material, and said that this was the first time they had seen such a terrible mood. Ken could not hold back a cry when he saw that they had hit the wall of his house with their hammer, causing cracks to appear. Mu, holding Ken's hand, clarified that these dwarves are kings of various states, and he should be polite, to which the guy responded with indifference, pointing out that this does not give them the right to brazenly destroy someone else's house. The king asked for forgiveness and clarified that these guys were a little wild, and while he was saying this, one of them actually hit the wall with a hammer again, which angered Ken, and he said that this was the second time that his house suffered because of someone else's curiosity. Hyungnam decided to ask Kana again whether he really was not the keeper of the tree. The guy introduced himself to the king, saying his name and saying that he is the owner of this house, but is not the keeper of the tree. The king again looked thoughtfully at the guy. Hyungnam accepted the situation and asked Khan for forgiveness for disturbing him and asked that if he didn't mind, could he treat them to a glass of water, to which Khan agreed. Mu modestly turned to her grandfather in the hope of learning something about the elf queen. The king understood what the princess meant and said that he heard everything, asking Mu that she seemed to have been kicked out, and the elf, burning with shame, tried to say that this was not so, and she went on a journey. Dwayne saw Mu's embarrassment and said that he understood everything, and then asked if the princess had achieved what she wanted, to which the elf began to explain the situation. But grandfather interrupted her, solemnly declaring that the queen of the elves would definitely arrive since the tree appears once every 5,000 years, and not only the queen, but all creatures would be at this event. Mu became even more uncomfortable because her grandfather was about to find out about the tree, and he, in turn, thought that the princess was uncomfortable because her mother would arrive, and laughed and said that the relationship between parents and children has always been difficult. Grandfather approached Mew and whispered to her a secret that his mother also kicked him out of the house 500 years ago. Mew was very surprised by what she heard, because in front of her was the king, but it turned out he was the same. Suddenly there was a command for everyone to line up, and Ken had to cover his face with his hands from the too bright light. Judging by the silhouettes with spears, some kind of army was walking ahead. This army was led by two riders on horses, namely the Duke and the Queen of the Elves. Kanu was not so bright either from the sun or from his fiery power. The Queen dismounted and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. She came closer to Dwayne and respectfully greeted him with a bow and called him the King of Gosen, and he, in turn, also bowed, saying that he was glad to meet the Queen. And only the Duke, despite all these rules and honors, ran as fast as he could, shouting his daughter. They hugged each other with tears in their eyes, and the father asked how his daughter was doing. The Queen turned to Sir Randall with a hint that there are rules of decency, and he suddenly found himself at a distance from his daughter. The restrained mother said that they had not seen each other for a long time and called her daughter by her full name, while the father, meanwhile, continued to wave and smile at his baby behind the Queen's back. Ken, behind Mu, looked at them the same way as before at the dwarves and only now realized that since the queen is Mu's mother, then she is really a princess, and in front of him are real elves. Mu had already started talking to her mother, but she asked if they could talk in private. Grandfather heard approaching sounds in the sky and, putting his hand to his face, raised his head up and announced someone's arrival. Huge humanoid birds descended from the sky like bullets, and Ken had not yet recovered from the shock when other lizard-like creatures appeared from under the ground right next to his feet. But that was not all, because on the other side the clatter of hooves was heard, and these guests already looked more like people. A certain gray-haired man with a crown on his head joked that he was the last to arrive, and the lizard said that everyone had already gathered and they were all heading to Hyungnim, and he greeted the leaders and turned to General Redu to find out if he had become king. The lizard replied that he had indeed become the king, and that he was glad to see Dwayne again, and Hyungnim, in turn, looked at the king of people and tried to remember something. The king of people saw Hyungnim's thoughtfulness and said that it was normal that grandfather could not remember him, because they met when the king was 5 years old, and ordinary people do not live that long. What the king said to the people made him, and Hyungnim, and the lizard laugh. Ken, terribly nervous, still approached the kings and, asking for forgiveness for interrupting them, asked someone to explain what was happening here. Grandfather answered Ken that their meeting was obvious because everyone had gathered to look at the sacred tree that appears once every 5,000 years, which made the guy feel uneasy again. The elf queen noticed that the king's people had suffered greatly, and she would help heal the wounds. The king of people confirmed the queen's suspicions, and said that on the way here they met many more monsters than usual, and this had never happened before. King Redu sympathized with the fact that this journey was difficult for the people, but immediately emphasizing their strength, he said that they managed, as always. The king of people, in his humorous manner, said to stop embarrassing him. The elf queen said that she had some kind of premonition, and remembered how she came to the same place when she was younger. The queen continued to say that now everything has changed a lot, and she does not feel the power of the sacred tree at all. King Redu said that the queen's feelings are quite obvious because the tree is at the stage of strengthening and monsters are also a common thing. Hyungnim somehow smiled heavily, and said that this is all wonderful, but there is one thing. Grandfather couldn't finish because one of the dwarves ran up and whispered something in his ear. Dwayne looked somewhere far into the distance and, surprised by something, said that everyone was already taking their seats and they risked being late. Ken also decided to look in the same place as his grandfather and was surprised 100 times more. The entire valley was filled with completely different creatures that were approaching the house. The creatures set up camp and lit a fire. They were all different and all moved differently. Ken still looked at the approaching guests with his mouth open and did not understand who they were. The guy turned to King Dwayne with the question of whether all these creatures came to look at the tree, to which the grandfather replied that this was so, and it was great because all the creatures that were once enemies now live in harmony. Ken looked as if his life had come to an end, and he was absolutely unable to say a word, and his grandfather said that it was time for them to go too and headed after the other kings and queen. All that Ken could squeeze out of himself was a hysterical laugh, and the words that he was finished. The creatures who arrived at the place of the tree were already having fun, raising their mugs and hitting one against the other, shouting for everyone to drink to the bottom. They lit a fire, and standing by it, they spoke loudly and laughed, shouting that today was their holiday. Some of the creatures even began to say toasts, and one of them was that luck was on their side. Taking up the excellent toast, others agreed, and with a smile on their faces said that they should thank fate for the fact that their generation has the opportunity to attend such a magnificent event. And while the inhabitants of this land joyfully shouted and had fun, Ken watched them from the window. The guy was all on edge and started gnawing on his fingers. Ken began to pace from side to side around the room, thinking about what he should do, because there was a risk that everyone would find out at whose hands the tree died. And holding his head, the guy again began, as he always did, to imagine the most terrible pictures of what would happen. This time Khan imagined himself on a cross that was blazing in fire. The guy leaned his hand against the glass of the window that overlooked the clearing where the creatures were walking and imagined how they would grind him into powder like he did with the wolf. And at that moment small sparks ran from his hand. Ken was annoyed and began to think again while continuing to look out the window. And then the guy, no matter how funny it was, fell against the wall as if he was telling someone dear that his death could not be allowed and he could not just give up. Ken, as if hugging the house, stood against the wall, turning to the house asking for help so that he could use his power to do something. The guy dreamily and hopefully touched the glass of the window and asked the house if he had heard him. This heartbreaking moment was interrupted by Mew's sudden question about what the gentleman was doing, which made Ken seriously scared and replied that he had not done anything like that. Ken saw a bunch of boxes in Mew's hands and asked what it was, and the elf replied that this food was so delicious that she couldn't help but share it with everyone, and this fact made Ken very upset because it was a hidden supply. Maya explained that Mr. Kobold found the boxes in the pantry next to the kitchen. The kobold realized that this was the food that Mr. Ken had already treated them to, and he also heated it in the microwave, watching the food while drooling. Ken had the usual reaction of anger, namely a burning fist because this dog had found food, which alerted Mew, and she addressed him by name in order to stop the fire. And Ken didn't even notice his burning hand, so he didn't understand why the princess turned to him questioningly. Mew quickly handed Ken the boxes of food and asked for help to carry them to the others. The princess thanked the guy, and while he was indignantly shouting something to her from the window, Mew was already going to the guests with a treat. Ken concluded that he had a lot of thoughts in his head again, and this time about how to stay alive. But he was still distracted by how many boxes of food there were in front of him, and he could remember whether there really was that much food at home. Ken's stream of thoughts was joined by the memory that he had not seen that girl with her Martin for a long time, and just at that moment, behind him, these two naughty girls were reaching for food. And while the guy was already imagining how he could blame them, the girl and her animal had already grabbed the food and disappeared. Ken decided that it was worth observing what was happening, and a way to solve the problem might appear, which is what the stranger was doing with the beast on the roof of the house, looking around and gobbling up semi-finished products. The kings and queen were sitting at the table, and Maya had just brought them that same divine food in boxes, and the rest was conveyed by Ken and Kobold. King Dwayne indicated that this food was quite unusual, to which King Ridu, who had not yet tried it, replied that he had never considered human food to be special. But I decided to try, like everyone else, what they brought. The lizard screamed furiously at how delicious it was. With a terrible appetite, Ridu began to gobble up pieces from 2 boxes at once, one after another, to which the king of birds, who was sitting next to him, refrained from commenting. The human king was also ready to eat the food, but 2 of his soldiers warned about the possibility that the food could be poisoned. Having heard the soldiers' warning about the poison, the elf queen tried a piece of food. The queen said that since no one was hurt, the king could start eating, to which he thanked the lady. And while the queen still behaved with restraint among the others at the table, the father stood next to Moo, who treated him to food, and told her how glad he was that his daughter had managed to grow up so quickly. Khan and the kobold looked towards the road, both surprised by what they saw. Under the light of the full moon, a clan of wire wolves walked towards them. The wolves walked past the guy and the kobold, heading towards the table where the kings and queen were sitting. Ken clenched his teeth, but not from fear, but from anger, when he realized that that wolf was among those who had now come here, and the kobold stood and cowered from fear. The chief of the wolves approached from the side of the table where King Hyungnim was sitting. The wolf said that information had reached him about the crimes committed here by their relative, after which, placing his paw on his chest, he offered his deepest apologies on his own behalf as the leader of the clan. The kings and queen repeated the wolf's gesture, and Hyungnim said that may their good faith be filled with the blessings of the sacred tree. The king of men and King Ridu talked to each other about whether the wolf was aware of the vulnerability of the tree at the moment, and perhaps they came for selfish reasons, and Ridu was generally sure that the wolf was a servant of the devil. Ridu asked again that at the last meeting he had not mentioned the connection between the wolf and the devil, because the devil would have taken advantage of the current situation. King Dwayne pointed out that the wolves are also guilty of what happened, because when one of their clan commits a crime, he upsets all the balance. So the wolf is now searching for the pest. Ken shouted that it was he who destroyed the one the clan was now looking for, and that they were the ones to whom the wolves should apologize. The wolf calmly asked if the guy really said what he said, and King Ridu laughed, and did not believe that a man alone could defeat the wolf, to which Ken immediately showed evidence in the form of the eyeball of a wire wolf that Mu had once given him. Surprise and a lot of questions froze on the faces of the leaders when they saw the eye, and Ken continued to explain that that wolf suddenly attacked the kobolds and deprived them of their home, seizing local lands. The Elf Queen agreed that an apology should be made to the kobolds, and when they heard this, they stood embarrassed. The wolf looked at them carefully, as if preparing to do something, and indeed, in an instant he found himself on one knee, bowing before the kobolds. The wolf said that he would understand if the kobolds did not forgive them, but he asked for their permission to restore their village. Kim was amazed that, being so stern-looking, the wolf could be so kind, and turned to the kobolds that the wolf's offer would fully compensate for the damage they had caused. The chief of the kobolds changed his face, and if before that he was embarrassed, now he turned to the wolf just as seriously, and was ready to give his answer. The kobold gave the wolf a speech in his own language with honor, and Mu, putting her hand in the same way as before, Wolf's Paw, translated the kobold's message as saying that they forgive the wolf clan, but refuse help because they themselves are able to restore their village, which surprised Ken, and he said that the kobold is cool. Their conversation was interrupted by two axes flying with a whistle, as if towards the house. Ken once again froze and looked death straight in the eye. The axe, spinning like a top, flew straight at him, cutting the air with the sound of a sharp blade. The guy managed to move away quite a bit, which is why he hit Mu, and the axe hit the wall of the house instead of his head. Ken and Mu turned to look at the axe, and the princess concluded that a fight had broken out where the weapon had come from. And while everyone rushed to where the axe had come from, the conflict was really raging, and someone who looked like an ogre shouted to his rival that he would cut off his head and make a stuffed animal out of it, to which another ogre, adding fuel to the fire, shouted to him to try to do what he threatened. They stood in the middle of the circle that all the creatures there had created to watch the duel. The green ogre grabbed the red one by the clothes, and he already realized what awaited him. Green threw Red over himself and turned him face to the ground. Red fell on his stomach to the ground just as the leaders approached them. Hyungnam stood in front of everyone as the eldest with an imperturbable look. King Ridu noticed that the fighters were not going to stop and decided to deal with them. It was at this moment that a foot shod in a slipper ran across the red ogre's face. Khan knocked out the ogre with one blow, and a stream of blood flowed from that wear and tear. The guy was again angry at the fact that his house was some kind of joke for them, and this blow to the face was clearly due to that crack in the house from an axe. Khan's face contorted when he realized what he had just done, and who he was emotionally attacking against. The guy grabbed his leg and fell to the ground screaming in pain. Mai and the kobold immediately ran to the aid of the would-be hero, and the princess asked if the master was okay, to which she naturally heard a negative answer. King Ridu, still in shock, told the king of people standing nearby that this man had knocked out an ogre that weighed about 500 kilograms, and the king asked again about the weight. The human king turned to his soldiers and caught them off guard with his question of whether they knew who this guy was, and voiced his doubts that this boy was one of them. King Hyungnam was amused by this situation, and said with confidence that this was an unusual person. The head of the wolf clan silently watched what was happening, and without saying anything, he turned around to leave. The elf queen noticed the wolves leaving but said nothing. Ken stood on both his legs in a strong position and looked at all the leaders. The guy shouted out to all the higher ranks that he didn't care whether they were kings or anyone else. Ken continued to swear that there is nothing polite about starting a bacchanal in the middle of the night next to someone else's house, and also eating his food and, most importantly, encroaching on his house. King Ritu shouted at the guy, waving his fist at him, that he was an ill-mannered brat, and how dared he talk like that. Mu, as always, was nearby and asked Mr. Kan to calm down. What caught Kan's attention was not Mu's address, but the stomping of feet from the direction of the broken camp. 3 huge carcasses were rushing towards the guy as fast as they could. These were other ogres, and they rushed towards Kan, shouting at him that how dared he hit one of them, and that he did not deserve forgiveness. Everyone froze in anticipation of what was about to happen. Kan was determined, and he felt anger boiling in him. Kan glowed with blue flames again, and with the help of the power of the house, he killed 3 huge ogres. The guy was angry as never before, and it was clearly visible on his face. Kan, emitting powerful energy, shouted that he would not allow anyone to approach his house. His voice, along with a powerful force, spread in waves throughout the clearing. All creatures covered their ears from such a sound stream, and only Hyanim and the queen calmly continued to stand in place. King Ritu and the king of birds also stood without changing their position. But the Mu kobolds and the king of men closed their eyes and ears in order to withstand this power. As it turned out, the stranger was on the roof all this time, and although she was able to hold on, it was difficult for her animal to do so. She tried to move closer to the edge because she didn't understand what was happening down there. Such a surge of power did not go unnoticed for the inhabitants of the island. The demon servant looked out of the window of the house again, peering through the telescope. While in the hands of a servant, the telescope exploded from overvoltage. The demon, as always, was busy doing what he loved, collecting cubes. But an explosion attracted the master's attention. The wave that can cause reached the island because of something that the demon had built fell apart. Ken stood with his hands clenched into fists, and circles of dust swirled around him like many craters. The most impressed of all was King Dwayne. The kobold, who froze like a statue, had the eye of a wire wolf fall out of his hands, and he didn't even notice it. Mew ran up to Ken and, putting her hands forward, asked him to calm down, and behind her at that moment, the eye that fell out of the kobold's hands was jumping further. Ken still stood in front of all the leaders and silently looked at them as they did at him. The guy realized that it was power again, and now the best option would be to go into the house. Cursing quietly, Ken turned towards the house and rushed towards the door with a quick step. The guy's serious intentions were disrupted by someone addressing him from behind. Kong turned his head and asked what they wanted from him, and saw Hyungnim looking at the man rather sternly. But abruptly changing his sternness to a good-natured smile, Dwayne asked if he could get more servings of the dish from the box. This definitely infuriated Ken, and he entered the house, slamming the door behind him, and his grandfather, sighing sadly, said that he really wanted more. King Ritu voiced his thoughts that the killing of the wolf by this guy was not an accident. Ritu walked past the disabled ogre and kicked him, saying that scum will remain scum even if the whole world changes. The elf queen tried to point out to Ritu that he still spoke as a general, but now he holds the title of king, so he should maintain his dignity, to which he said that all races that were associated with the devil must be wiped off the face of the earth. Remaining dissatisfied, Ritu left, and Hyungnim still reminded him that the king should not forget to come tomorrow before dawn. The king of people approached Dwayne and said that he would take his leave in the same way, but the elder detained him. They were left to talk alone, and Hyungnim asked the king of people if he had found what the elder asked him for, to which he received a negative answer, reasoned by the fact that this is not just considering that the only information they have is the age of the boy. After the conversation, the human king still bowed to Hyungnim, and, accompanied by his soldiers, he left the clearing. But taking advantage of the fact that the king of people was still not far away, he asked Dwayne if it was true that the new king of the demonic race was a human, and he was less than 10 years old. Judging by the faces of the queen and Hyungnim, this was so, but they remained silent, and the queen only clarified that such things should be discussed in a specially designated place. Immediately the queen remembered that a lot of time had passed, and she, turning to her daughter, said that she would like to talk to her. Mu was surprised by her mother's desire to talk to her. There was no one at the house anymore because it was late at night. Kim lay in his bed, but could not sleep. The guy blew himself up, grabbing his head and screaming about what he should do anyway, because if he doesn't think of everything, he might be burned at the stake at sunrise. Khan was torn from his thoughts by what he saw opposite him in his room. Judging by only one bright eye, a huge body and fluff fur, the leader of the wolf clan was sitting in front of the guy. Naturally, Kim was frightened both from surprise and from danger. The wolf rose to his full height and said that he was waiting for the guy to wake up. The wolf explained that although the guy who killed committed many atrocities on the orders of the Demon King, he was part of their family. Ken inquired about the outcome of everything he had just heard, for which the wolf apologized in advance for his rudeness. And telling the guy nothing personal, he pointed his huge fist right at him. Ken has already seen so much, but every time he looks at such an attempt on his life as if it was the first time. The blow hit the bed just as the guy jumped away from it like a ball. Ken, landing on the floor, swore at the wolf, "What the hell is he doing?" because he apologized for his relative, and now he is acting so hypocritically. But immediately in his head, he denied it, because the wolf waited for the guy to wake up. The guy continued the conversation with the wolf, saying that since he decided to take revenge so suddenly, Ken stood up in defense and ended his address to the wolf with the word forward. Khan looked his opponent in the face with complete readiness, to which the wolf did the same and reacted approvingly. But Khan, as if nothing had happened, lowered his hands as during a normal conversation and explained something to the monster. Namely, the guy explained that although he said that he was ready to fight, it was better for them to change the place of battle, and pointed his finger at the clearing. The wolf silently looked at the man and thought about his words, after which the monster simply answered well, which surprised Ken because his opponent easily agreed. The wolf turned to the exit, but due to his size, he hit his head on the ceiling and began to destroy the guy's room, to which he asked the monster to go out more carefully. The wolf again answered well, but after trying to get out, he laughed and asked how to get out, to which Ken, unable to bear it, screamed. The elf queen made sure that, as she said, there was a secluded place for conversation, and took out a seed that glowed like a firefly. Mew looked questioningly at her mother, but said nothing. The queen placed the seed in the ground, deepening it a little. Mew and Hyungnam carefully watched what would happen next, but still misunderstanding was visible on their faces. In an instant, a tree began to grow from a small seed, stretching its branches higher and higher. The tree was approximately the size of Khan's house, with powerful roots and branches. Among the bends of the tree, the entrance to the inside of its trunk lit up, and the queen invited everyone to go inside. Hyungnam complimented the queen, emphasizing that she was quite talented, and Mew, in turn, thought to herself that this was quite expected from her mother. An elven guard stood in front of the tree so that no one else would come inside. The queen sat at the table and looked at the scroll, and the father still could not stop admiring his daughter. The queen, looking at the scroll in front of her, which had a gaping hole in the middle, concluded that it was definitely made from the birch bark of a sacred tree. She also added that the scroll was similar to the one she brought with her, which also had a hole burned through it. Mu noticed that the scrolls looked exactly the same, and did not notice how her father could not get enough of the meeting. King Dwayne looked at the two identical scrolls, and thought out loud that the tree had suddenly disappeared from the map, and tried to understand why this happened. Mu stood up with excitement, and turned to her grandfather and mother with the words that she had read from ancient books about the impossibility of a tree to disappear because it would take root in any case. But the mother interrupted her daughter, and pointed out that they saw someone uproot the sprout. Mu couldn't agree, but she also couldn't deny the fact that the sprout was being uprooted, because it was so. The queen said that over the past 1,000 years there have been many large and small battles, and the balance of the world was maintained by two sacred trees that balanced the forces in the east and west. Hyungnam added on his own that with the killing of the demon, the tree in the east was destroyed, and now there is only one left in the west. Mew, very worried, asked what to do now. Grandfather replied that if the last tree was destroyed, great chaos would ensue, and the era would come to an end. Mu stood at the table, and there was silence in the negotiation room. The Duke decided to voice his idea that if there was no second tree, wouldn't that just balance the forces in the world? Everyone silently stared at the Duke, and only the Queen turned to him questioningly. Seeing Madame's reaction, Duke said that it was a joke, which made Mu feel a little awkward. Hyungnam laughed so hard that he grabbed his stomach and told the Duke that he absolutely did not understand why their ancestors hated him so much, to which the Duke also laughed. The Queen still restrainedly announced that the sacred tree should appear at dawn, and then they would know about everything. After this, the Queen turned to her daughter. Mia asked what her mother wanted to tell her, which is why she was a little excited. The Queen asked if the princess had found what she was looking for. Mu lowered her gaze, and it was clear that she did not know what to answer her mother. The silhouette of one of the guards appeared at the entrance to the tree. The guard went inside and asked for forgiveness for interrupting the conversation, said that they should look at something, and pointed his hand towards the clearing. Ken and the wolf left the house for a duel or possibly a battle. When Ken realized that he had begun to move further away from the house than he could, he stopped the wolf, to which the wolf replied that there was space, that the man wanted so as not to affect his house. Ken thought to himself that the wolf said everything correctly, but remembered the distance within a radius of 10 meters from the house where he could use the force. Ken tried to talk to the wolf, asking why he had come, and voiced his thoughts that he did not think that the wolf had a strong desire for revenge. Ken suggested that the leader fight inside a circle that did not exist. The wolf did not understand at all what the man meant. The guy showed a stick with which he was going to draw a circle. Ken easily began to draw a line along the ground with a stick. Like an ordinary person, the guy moved quite quickly. The wolf could only stand and watch, waiting. Khan had almost completed the circle, leaving trails of dust behind him. And so the circle closed, and the guy stood happy with the work he had done. Khan explained that there are only 2 rounds, and if the wolf wants to give up, he can simply leave the circle. The leader replied that this was something new and asked if such an area was enough, to which Ken thought to himself that the wolf did not suspect that it would not be possible to knock the guy out of the circle. The guy mentioned that the relatives of the wolves had much less space for the fight. The wolf noticed the man's boasting and warned him that pride is a direct path to destruction. The leader's eye lit up as if there was fire inside. Ken remained confidently standing with his back to the enemy, while Vok was already making a swing. A huge wolf's paw with claws sharp as blades rose upward. Khan dodged the blow as calmly and easily as if it were a game. The guy turned to the wolf with a grin and asked if it was enough for him to just stand still. The wolf was shocked by the blatant impudence and ridicule of the man. The leader raised his paw again, but this time it was already clenched into a fist, and he repeated the same blow as the wire wolf had done before. Ken, still standing in a bent position, saw a wolf's fist rushing straight at him. The guy jumped away from the place where he could have already been crushed into a cake. The wolf looked at the maneuver the man had performed. The leader tried to hit the guy again, but he fell to the ground at that moment. Ken, having completed his fall by moving a distance away from the wolf, again asked him with a smile whether he was fighting too slowly. The wolf fixed his calm gaze on the man. The monster grabbed the bandage that covered one of its eyes with its paw and began to say something in response. Khan was more alarmed by this movement than by the powerful blows before. The wolf took off the blindfold, and where there seemed to be no eye there was a light shining, the same as when Ken is under the influence of the power of the house. The leader went to the guy with the words that it was time to become more serious, which caused complete bewilderment in the man. Ken remained silent, but there was not a drop of fear or doubt in his gaze. Everyone who came to look at the tree woke up from a powerful glow from the side of the house. One of the guests asked the other if the sacred tree had really appeared so early, to which the second guest replied that it was not a tree, but that it seemed like a fight had broken out there. Residents, talking to each other, tried to understand that the person standing there was the very owner of the house. The crowd came closer, and everyone saw that the leader of the wolf clan was against the man. Someone asked whether the man really decided to go against the wolf, and someone shouted that the little man was brave. Ken stood in full combat readiness, and the leader told him approvingly that they would try to fight. Someone from the crowd shouted to the wolf to show the selfish man. Mu rushed towards the guy as fast as she could and shouted his name. The queen and Hyungnim watched what was happening, and grandfather said amusingly that this was an interesting sight, because he was always interested in learning about human strength. The princess shouted that the battle must be stopped right now. King Dwayne asked Mu not to worry so much because he was sure that the wolf would not harm the boy. The princess shouted that it was not Mr. Ken that she needed to worry about, but she did not have time to say who this person was. Ken activated the power and red lightning appeared from his hand, and when Mai saw this, she was already horrified because she remembers how it ended. Ken did not have time to use the force, and had to jump away from the place where the wolf struck. The guy instantly reacted to the movement from the side. Another fist of the leader was rushing towards Khan, when Khan had just landed after the last blow. The man managed to move from the place where the blow was planned to be struck. Ken successfully dodged this powerful blow from the leader. The guy remained behind the wolf, continuing to slide along the ground after the jump. The man concluded for himself that after removing the blindfold, the wolf became much faster. The clan leader, in turn, also thought to himself that this man was unusual and could not believe that the guy managed to avoid the attack. But despite this, the wolf considered the guy clumsy, as if he was using his strength for the first time. The wolf turned to the man with words of misunderstanding of how he was able to defeat their relative. The monster bared its claws, which sparkled as if they were made of steel. The leader, developing speed, rushed towards the guy, putting his paw with claws in front of him. Ken, seeing this, realized that the matter would be more complicated than with the previous wolf. The guy barely managed to dodge this blow, and it hit the ground again. How immediately the second paw with claws was already flying towards the person. The young man confidently told his opponent that no matter how much he tried to attack, he would not succeed. The wolf's words about pride leading to destruction took their toll, and the guy, not seeing a hole in the ground, twists his leg. Ken begins to lose his balance and fall backward, clearly not expecting such a trick. The guy's gaze still catches the next movement from the enemy. This time the leader took Ken by surprise, and those same claws passed close to the man's body. The queen also calmly watched everything, unlike the duke, who watched the battle with all his might, and did not hold back his emotions. When Mai saw that fatal blow, she was afraid that this was the end, and Hyungnim also stood nearby, worried about what had happened. Ken, like a statue, stood in place and could not move after the blow inflicted by the wolf. There were torn stripes on the guy's clothes, clearly indicating where the wolf's claws passed and reached the body. Ken took off his jacket and began to scratch himself, shouting that the scratches were burning and he thought that he was finished. Mu saw that Khan was alive, but still shouted if Mr. Man was okay. Ken's attention was attracted by some sounds from the side, and he was distracted from his wounds. It was the crowd who shouted that they thought that the guy was a weakling, but he turned out to be strong enough, and now they like him, and they asked Ken to continue to fight and beat this vulture. Ken was shocked when he saw the crowd of people, and could not understand when they all managed to gather here. He was so focused on the battle. The guy was distracted for a while, and, getting into a position of readiness for battle, realized that he would not be able to use the fireworks skill because of the crowd, and thought that he would be able to solve everything with physical force. The leader, looking at his paw, also at that moment was thinking about how strange it was that the guy did not die and there was not a single scratch on him, although the wolf remembered exactly how he struck. The wolf told the guy that the last blow was dealt with great speed, and after this the opponents did not survive. Ken asked if the wolf's speed was not maximum, because this means that the leader would be able to move even faster. The wolf confirmed the man's words, and explained that in the future the speed would be increased by 30% higher. The leader decided not to hesitate and demonstrate what he was capable of, and, baring his teeth, growled the command to change the essence. The curves and shape of the wolf's paws acquired different features, but he remained the same. The fur on the withers became thicker and more fluffed, and the tail lengthened. The wolf's mouth also changed, but did not stop being just as terrifying. Ken swore, and was shocked by these changes, indicating that the wolf decided to cheat. The leader has turned from a humanoid creature into a real wolf that stands on 4 legs, confirming that it will indeed be many times faster. The princess shouted that this was too much, and Hyeongnam was also surprised by the leader's metamorphosis. The wolf began to pick up speed, no longer having the advantage of 2 but 4 paws. Like a huge truck, it cut through the air, rushing straight towards the person. Khan was numb as he watched another death machine move towards him again. But the wolf, instead of attacking the young man, ran very close to him and rushed further. The next wave of wind and dust remained behind the guy. Ken saw that he was in the middle of the circles of dust that the wolf made, as if spinning a funnel. The guy was surprised by the speed that the wolf developed, but he was still ready. The wolf jumped out of the crater towards the house, almost to the roof. The animal decided to perform a maneuver, and pushed off the wall of the house with its paw. The wolf made a leap back into the crater in the blink of an eye. Ken understood why everything was done, and saw the beast heading towards him like a bullet. The guy stood firmly on his feet, and took a defensive position, covering his face with his hands across his face. The wolf struck the man with his entire body. Ken, despite all the previous blows and speed, only now felt how strong this wolf was. The wolf drove away due to a collision with the guy's protection, from which a road of dust spread behind him. The beast ran away again, picking up incredible speed. And like a battering ram, he hit the guy's head, from which he naturally flew away. Mu couldn't find a place for herself and shouted out the master's name every time. Ken wiped his face from sweat and dirt and realized that he couldn't cope with the spider last time, and it wasn't even close to the wolf. Growling menacingly, the wolf told the guy that it was time to end this. Ken decided for himself that he was not going to give up at all, and he had no choice but to use force, and his hand was already ready, sparkling with energy. The wolf was also not the timid type, so he bared his teeth and ran up to attack. Ken mentally asked the house not to hit anyone else by force. The guy screamed fireworks and put his hand in front of him. The wolf's body was illuminated by a bright approaching stream of fiery power. The flow was powerful and many times larger than a person, but Ken steadfastly directed it. The stream sparkled with red lightning and was directed directly at the wolf. The wolf did not expect this and realized that he could not dodge. Mu and Hyeongnam stood in front of the entire crowd and no longer shouted anything, but only watched. This time even the queen was shocked by what she saw, not to mention the duke, who almost lost his jaw. Ken did not see the wolf, but only the wall of fire in front of him, but did not lower his hand. The guy himself did not believe that he could exude such power. The wolf was still alive, and was able to hold back the flow of power that came from Khan. The leader again had to return to his humanoid form in order to hold the fiery beam, but the energy was still too strong. Kim was glad that the power only hit the wolf, as he had asked for at the house before the attack. The leader had to make an effort to restrain the force, and he realized that it was incredibly powerful, and it was difficult for him to believe that a person was capable of such a thing. But the wolf also noticed for himself that the energy is quite unstable. Khan shouted to the beast whether he was giving up, because the guy was worried about his opponent since he looked weakened. The leader, continuing to hold the flow, answered the guy that if he had to surrender so quickly, he would not have offered a fight. Ken shouted that the leader was too stubborn and asked if he really didn't want to give up even after such power. The stream had already turned into a huge wheel, but the wolf continued to hold it, and said that he would never give up. The guy realized that the situation was becoming truly dangerous, and thought that he should stop. And then Ken asked himself the question of how to stop this force. Mu had very keen hearing, and she caught what Ken said quietly to himself. The princess screamed in horror, asking Ken that he really didn't know how to stop, and Hyeongnam couldn't help but react to his granddaughter's scream. The queen, as always, from an even state, noticed that if this continues, then the unexpected might happen. And the lady was right, because Ken screamed because he could no longer control the situation, because the power of the skill began to increase on its own. The force really raged at full speed, and was no longer a stream, but a chaotic tangle. King Dwayne, who rarely could be frightened or surprised by anything, covered himself with his hands. King Ridu, turning to Hyungnam, again emphasized that this ill-mannered person was creating trouble. The lizard told Grandpa that they should move away from the epicenter of events. Hyungnam asked Ridu if he had seen the King of People, to which the lizard replied that they had evacuated all the creatures of the weak race so that the sage need not worry. The queen also covered herself, and the duke and her daughter stood nearby, hugging each other, protecting each other. The elven guards lined up in a protective circle and, holding two shields like doors, shouted to the queen to hurry inside. The inhabitants leaned closer to the ground, covering themselves with their hands, and the king of birds and his subjects flew up. The stranger who was still on the roof could barely keep her hand from the flow of the wind. The girl barely managed to hold on with one hand, and with the other she held the animal, which was squeaking pitifully, almost by the tip of its tail. The wolf leaned on the weight of his entire body in order to hold this red-hot ball of fire. The strength continued to grow, and the wolf, as if resisting, began to slide further along the ground, and his paws no longer helped. The leader shouted that he could no longer hold the energy. The stream became bright, and rays radiated from it as if from the sun. The leader took this blow upon himself, and the force rose up like a hurricane. Kan, continuing to be under the influence of the force, and seeing what happened, screamed in despair. The wolf fell head over heels to the ground from the impact of the wave. The leader sprawled his body on the ground and tried to come to his senses. The wolf said that human strength is something and accepted his defeat without trying anything else, to which Kan shouted that the defeat of the leader is absolutely not important now, because power does not obey a person. The wolf jumped up from what he heard and shouted for the man to stand still, otherwise he would hurt the others. Kan was scared that no matter how hard he tried to do something, it would be useless. The guy had nothing else to do and turned his gaze towards the house. Kan asked for help from his home while continuing to hold the flow. The man did not give up trying to get help and shouted to the house that this was his power, and again asked the house to do something. The force became a huge fiery whip that a person could no longer control. Kan again shouted to the house whether he could hear his master and politely said that he hoped for him. Although the house stood motionless and did not make a single sound or sign, Kan felt that he had done something. Mu, apparently, also noticed some changes in behavior and screamed the master's name. The stream became incredibly huge compared to a person. Mu had already rushed to help the guy, but her father grabbed her by the hand and said that it was too dangerous. Kan realized that he wanted to make a house, and he had a hard time believing it. Mu and Duke stood in front of a bright wall of light and saw nothing else except it. The queen remained under the protection of her guards, but also saw what happened next. King Ridu and Hyungnam remained standing in place, watching the developments. The king of birds and his subjects continued to be in the sky, although they could have fled the scene faster than others. The main kobold commanded his relatives to run to a safe distance. Kan no longer held the flow, but only watched where it was going. The guy didn't want to believe what he saw and what he understood. The man screamed at the top of his lungs for everyone to run back. The stream shone so brightly, as if it was morning, and the sun had risen. After the bright light, there was an explosion, as if a bomb had been dropped. Kan was thrown by the blast wave into a wall of earth and dust. A person in flight could see what was happening while being closest to the center of the explosion. The guy covered his face with his hands and tried to clear his throat while peering into the fog. A dust cloud rose in front of the man, higher than his house. Kan could not believe that this could happen and that what was happening now was true. The dust tornado did not fall to the ground, but for some reason only gained momentum. The Duke and his daughter still stood hugging each other, protecting each other, and shielding themselves from the dusty wind. Mu and father were scared and excited, but still turned towards the house and thought that everything was already over. The voices of residents could be heard from the crowd, and they asked each other if it was all over, and someone said that they thought that everyone would die. King Ridu stood next to Dwayne and loudly asked if anyone was hurt. As always, the first thing I wanted to know was whether the person was alive, and the poet cried out his name with emotion. The princess rushed into the thick of the dust, which only raged even more, and this time the Duke did not have time to stop her. Somewhere from the depths of the dusty cloud came the voice of the leader, who warned anyone to approach there. As it turned out, the wolf was still holding the huge ball of fire, and shouting that the effect of the force had not ended yet. The leader made an effort with his whole body to hold the red-hot spinning ball, and said that he would not allow anyone to interfere in the battle between him and the man. Mu stood in front of the dusty curtain and tried to object, but then her mother came up and, putting her hand on her shoulder, told her daughter to just stand and watch. King Ritu heard the wolf's warning and asked if the shockwave had not yet disappeared and cursed because absolutely nothing was visible. Since the bird king could watch from above, he went down to Ritu and said that the wolf chief was barely holding back the wave. Hyungnam, as always, looked thoughtful and came to the conclusion after what the king of birds said that if the cloud of power explodes, then everyone could die. King Ritu cried out that this was impossible. Could an ordinary person do such a thing? The king of birds turned to Dwayne that they needed to be careful, and apparently wanted to say something about this power that Hyungnam would understand. But he didn't say anything. The still thoughtful King Hyungnam stood calmly, as if there was no blast wave next to him that could destroy everything that was in the immediate radius of its action. The kings and queens stood in front of Hyungnam and waited for some kind of answer or solution to the problem from him. The fiery wheel became twice as large, but the wolf still held it. Only such a creature could touch such a powerful accumulation of energy that also sparkled. While the wolf was holding back the wave, he was tormented by thoughts about how a person could do something like this, and what to do about it now. The wave grew, wanting to break out more and more, and holding it became more difficult every minute. The wolf realized for himself that he was running out of strength to retain energy, and if it continued to grow, and he weakened, then the others could suffer. The wolf turned his attention to the direction where the guy stood. Ken stood to the side with his hands down, literally and figuratively, because he had never encountered anything like this before. For the first time, the guy couldn't control the force, and didn't know what to say or how to help. The wolf became angry because he did not understand what kind of incredible power could be created by such a boy. The leader leaned forward with his whole body, straightening his powerful paws, and his strength, as if sensing this stubbornness, only sparkled more. The wolf felt that the energy was alive, and he was fighting with it, and not with the guy as it should have been initially. No matter how powerful the clan leader was, the force grew more and more and began to move him, so that his paws were already sliding on the ground. The wolf felt his displacement and said, as if turning to force, that he needed a little more time, and he believed that the shock wave should gradually subside. But judging by the crowd, which began to be knocked off their feet by the force of the wind, the wave was not going to subside. Mu looked straight ahead at this ball of fire and heard exclamations from the crowd that the thread was growing larger and would explode very soon. King Dwayne, soberly assessing the situation, told everyone that the leader would not last too long. And this really was so because from where the wolf was one could hear his curses from a state of hopelessness. King Ritu realized that the matter was rubbish and turned to the crowd and shouted to everyone to bend down. All the creatures, even if they had not heard Ritu's order, would still have ducked down because the force was destructive and they were too close. The queen and Mu and the duke stood behind the shields of the elven guards. King Ritu and Hyungnam also fell to the ground, covering themselves with their hands. The explosion was so powerful and bright, as if a new star had been born or a meteorite had fallen to the ground. The wolf did not have time to lie down on the ground or hide somewhere, and as if he were as light as a feather, he was thrown to the side. The wave stretched across the entire clearing and reached the crowd, throwing red sparks. The flash disappeared so quickly that the wolf stood in the middle of the clearing, still holding his paws in front of him, looking around and could not understand whether he was alive or not. Small tongues of flame were already flying above the residents, who were still covering their heads with their hands as a residual from what had happened. The elves also did not dare let alone come out of the shelter of their shields, or even raise their heads. The king of birds and his subjects were in the sky all this time, and King Ritu and Hyungnam, like everyone else, also covered themselves with their hands. Kin stood with his mouth open looking at the sky where the flames were flying, gradually dying out. The wolf and the guy, who miraculously survived everything, stood and watched the sparks that flew around them. Fortunately, everyone remained alive and unharmed, including the house, to which nothing happened. The wolf found his eye patch and frantically picked it up from the ground. The crowd approached the circle of battle and again began whispering to each other whether it was all over this time, and whether no one had died, and that, as expected from the leader of the wolves, he had coped. The wolf told the guy who was still standing aside that his hands were shaking so much that he couldn't even put on his bandage. The guy was covered by the huge shadow of the wolf, and at that moment he finally came to his senses. The leader turned to the man with the words that he was outside the circle, and the guy was surprised by the calmness of the wolf. Ken lowered his head and saw that he was indeed standing about a meter from the circle line. The leader asked the man how it turned out that he won the battle. The guy couldn't find an answer because he had just almost died and almost ruined the others, and the wolf remembered their deal. The leader silently turned around without putting on the bandage and left the battlefield. Ken turned to the wolf, asking him to stay for a minute. The leader stopped and turned halfway to the man, waiting. Ken, looking down, could not find anything more to say except gratitude. The wolf took a deep breath and told the man that power was not for him, and it was too early for him to possess it. Ken silently accepted this truth, which was terrible to comprehend. The leader continued by saying that he doesn't know how the guy got the power, but he hopes that such situations will not happen again. The wolf went towards the forest, and the guy remained standing in place, and Moo and the kobold rushed towards him, happy that the master was alive. The queen turned to King Dwayne with words about what happened as she suspected, and Hyungnam also said that it was not in vain that he was worried. The queen announced the terrible news to everyone that the sacred tree would not bloom. King Ritu began to scream, and could not believe the words spoken by the queen. He asked again what she was talking about, and how this tree would not blossom. While the kings were trying to comprehend the news about the tree, an angry crowd was raging near the house, which Moo and the kobold fought off from the man. Everyone shouted to Ken that he almost killed them, and if it weren't for the leader of the wolves, the unfortunate little man would have done it. They waved their arms and were ready to tear Ken into pieces, shouting for the guy to get out of their world and not even think of approaching the sacred tree. And Ken, as if in a fog, walked further towards the house. Ken opened the door of the house and stones began to fly at him, while Mai and Kobold continued to defend him and shouted that the residents were saying terrible words. Ken was already standing inside the house, and through the slightly open door they could hear shouts for him to get out of the house, and they shouted that he was a coward for once deciding to hide. The door closed, and the guy still stood in place and could not move. Meanwhile, in the thick of the forest, a certain woman was sitting at a table with a cup in her hand. A long-haired, beautifully dressed woman was sipping tea at a white coffee table made of white porcelain. The tea party was interrupted by some creatures with bats with sharp spikes on them. They were angry and headed towards the woman, clearly in an attack mood. The lady continued to enjoy her tea as if nothing had happened and took a sip. The creatures approached the mysterious lady with their weapons at the ready. The woman noticed the approach and, while talking, said that the tea in this place was not very tasty, and added as if they weren't even trying. Raising her head, the woman with a grin directed her fox-like gaze at the guests. The lady stood up from the table with a cup in her hands, and around there were already many of the same creatures, frozen like stone. The woman walked slowly, and walked further along the path into the forest. She stopped, contemplating from above the valley that was burning with fire, holding a cup in her hands. The woman was pleased with the result she saw, which, judging by the creatures that wanted to kill her, she did. The lady turned around and addressed the local creatures with a smile, continuing her playful conversation. The armed inhabitants of the very valley that was now burning were beside themselves with rage. They rushed at her, raising their weapons above them and screaming, baring their fangs. The woman remained standing with her back to them, and only smiled at the fury of these creatures. The creatures did not have time to reach them, when the shadow of a huge winged monster loomed over them. The monster looked like a dragon, and was so huge that it covered almost the entire sky as if night had fallen. The woman turned around at the moment when the monster hung in the air, and now her confidence was clear. The dragon flew higher, and the lady threw out the cup and ironically suggested finding better tea. The morning dawn illuminated the sky, and someone was sitting in front of the house, as if guarding something. In front of the house, the main kobold was really sitting like a sultan, leaning on his sword. The kobold was serious and focused on his security mission. Apparently the kobold sat there all night without closing his eyes, so he began to feel sleepy, and from the next bend forward in a half-asleep state, the kobold threw himself up, moving his head to the sides and holding his sword in front of him. Mai, as always, appeared silently and suddenly asked Kobold if he had been on guard all night, which excited the dog. Mew turned to the window of the man's room and, forgetting his name, began to shout out Gunnam and asked if he could hear her, and then said that fortunately everyone was safe and sound. The princess continued to call the man by the wrong name, and said that everything was fine, and asked him to come out when he was ready. Mew and Kobold stood sad because Ken did not respond, apparently upset or scared because of yesterday. The princess turned to the kobold and said that a day had passed since the man locked himself away, apparently due to the fact that the shock was very strong. Kobold and Mai sighed heavily and sat down on the ground, leaning on the house, and at that moment someone nearby chuckled thoughtfully. The leader of the wolf clan with rewound paws was sitting nearby, terribly frightening the princess and the kobold when they turned around to grunt. The wolf asked if he had scared the elf, for which he apologized, and Mew embarrassedly replied that he hadn't really scared her. The leader, having heard the conversation between Mew and Kobold about the shock that the guy received, now said that the shock would not be very good, which the princess did not understand. The wolf tried to explain that a man appeared out of nowhere and defeated one of their relatives, and immediately after that the Arakine, and this is what the leader heard. The leader put his paw to the bandage on his forearm and added himself to the aforementioned monsters. Rising from the ground, the wolf said that it would be impossible for any other person to have such strength. Now all three of them looked at the window of the house in the hope of seeing a person there. The wolf continued to say that the consequences of a person's use of force will be as great as the amount of force he used, but no one appeared in the window of the house. It remained empty and dark. The house itself somehow faded and became gray and lethargic, and all the doors were closed, including the one where the guy was. Everyone gathered in front of the clearing where the house stood, waiting for the appearance of the sacred tree. The kings and queens stood in front of everyone, and the guards behind them held the flags of their kingdoms. On one side stood King Ridu, and behind him the King of Birds. On the other side stood the Queen of the Elves, and behind her the King of Men. The sun was almost at its zenith, but there was no hint of the appearance of a tree in the clearing. Panic spread among the crowd, and so far only the residents whispering among themselves did not understand why the sprout had not yet bloomed, and why the tree was not blooming. King Ridu also began to succumb to this panic, listening to the thoughts of the crowd that maybe they had chosen the wrong place, or maybe they had mixed up the date. The king of people heard that someone from the crowd answered that both the place and date were correct, to which the question again followed why the tree did not bloom. The residents began to realize that the tree was not blooming because there was a human house on the sacred hill, from which the kings and queen realized that the complexity of the situation was only increasing. King Hyungnam and queen decided to immediately go to the big tree's meeting room. In front of the tree where the negotiations were taking place, the elven guard again stood. Being away from the crowd, King Ridu gave vent to his emotions and shouted to the queen to explain so that he would understand why, 3 days after the promised date, the tree did not bloom. The king of people tried to express his assumption that perhaps they had mixed up the date, to which Ridu became even more furious and yelled at the man that this was nonsense and that he should shut up and, getting personal, pointed out to the king of people that he should be honored so that everyone else would allow him to stand here. The elf queen drank tea and absolutely calmly asked Ridu to refrain from making rude remarks, after which the bird king, thinking out loud, said what could happen because of which there is no tree. The leader of the birds turned to the queen with a question, reminding her that she had not once made the same mistake when she withdrew her troops after the disappearance of the former demon king and was seriously injured. Ridu exclaimed, remembering that moment, and said how could he forget this because they'd lost so many comrades and land. Then something dawned on Ridu, and he asked the queen what she said. But instead of the queen, Hyeonim answered, repeating the words that the power of the world tree was again absorbed by someone. The human king assumed that this was the new demon king, but the bird king denied this, and said that they were closely watching him, and since that day he has not moved from his place. King Ridu, being at the limit, shouted who then could it be and hit the table. The king of people was shocked by Ridu's reaction, and said that it was probably time for him to go because he shouldn't leave the empire in its place for long. Ridu, turning to the exit, blurted out that they were also leaving since there was no world tree, and there was no need for them to cooperate. King Dwayne quietly turned to the queen, asking what they should do if all this was true, to which the lady replied that it was worth observing a little. Having interrupted the heated conversations, the same mysterious lady who destroyed the settlement in the middle of the forest entered the hall and asked if everyone was really gathered here. Already nervous and frightened, everyone was shocked by the guest, and the queen recognized her as someone whom she was clearly not happy to see. The lady smiled and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, pointing out that they were all hypocritical as always. Only King Dwayne, the queen of the elves, and the king of birds reacted calmly, but with caution to the appearance of the guest. But Ridu and the king of men were in shock. The mysterious guest, still smiling, let them all know that she was disgusted by how hypocritical she had already said they all were. King Dwayne stopped pretending to be thoughtful and turned to the stranger. The lady smiled in anticipation that not only the queen recognized her, but Hyeonim, holding his glasses, quite seriously asked the question of who in front of him had angered the stranger with what. King Ridu nervously shouted to Hyeonim not to say that to someone he doesn't know, and Grandpa, in turn, said that he was already quite old, so his memory was not very good. The guest, quite tired of these conversations, slammed her hand on the table, drawing the attention of those present to herself. The lady asked again, baring her fangs, whether the old man really did not recognize her, after which she introduced herself as Marianne Antoinette Oscar III. Hyeonim remembered who it was, but he couldn't quite believe it, that in front of him was a rather dangerous person. Mariana, seeing her grandfather's gaze, shouted that he understood everything correctly, and after that, pointing her finger at Hyeonim, she said that she was his queen. Marianne solemnly told everyone that she was the demon king. As always, unlike other leaders, Ridu and the human king reacted most emotionally to the appearance of the demon king. As if Hyeonim was not a fiend in front of him, but an old acquaintance, he pointed his finger at Marianne and shouted that he remembered that it was really her. The elf queen leaned towards King Dwayne, and he whispered something to her, pointing at Marianne. After Hyeonim's words, the elf queen looked at Marianne with a more understanding look. The lizard king cried out that he also remembered that Mariana was the child of the demon king who had escaped from the castle, and that he had heard that someone had taken the throne. The guest clearly did not like such a statement, and it was clear that she was angry. Her voice became as if it were in hell, and she asked if those present wanted to say anything else. Maybe someone was about to run away. Everyone had to cover their faces with their hands from the bright purple light that came from the demoness. The elf queen did not cover her face with her hand, but maintained an even state and raised her hand above herself. The lady made a movement with her hand to remove the demoness radiance. The purple glow changed to green, sacrificing the natural powers of the lady elf. The demoness looked questioningly but carefully at the queen of the elves, most likely realizing that she was not the only one with powers here. The lady, being serious, asked Marian what she had forgotten here. This time the demoness silently accepted the question without a smile, continuing to keep her gaze on the queen. But after the meeting of the eyes of two strong rivals, Marian returned the grin to her face and answered with a counter-question. Isn't everyone here gathered for the same reason? Marian said that she had been looking forward to this moment since that very day on the hill. She looked at everyone with a sly and threatening look and continued that she had finally come to take her place, and asked those present if they would help her. King Ridu snorted, indicating that the demoness' statement was completely absurd, and asked who she perceived them to be. Ridu suddenly appeared with 2 battle axes in his hands, and shouted that he would kill the demoness right there. Mariana, clearly having an ace up her sleeve, indifferently asked the lizard if he would really do this. The demoness fixed her gaze on the exit from the tree, and this time asked everyone if they could defeat her. As it turned out, Mariana was not looking at the exit in vain, because the guard who was near the tree was lying writhing in pain. The guards made an effort to get up, but it was no use. Marian just spread her arms to the sides, as if nothing was her fault, and stood calmly in front of the leaders. The elven guard rushed to attack the demoness, shouting how dare she do such a thing, but Mariana just stood there and smiled. It was enough for the demoness to snap her fingers, and not make much effort to protect herself. The guard seemed to have fallen into a trance, hanging in the air without any movement. King Ridu still held axes in his hands, and gave the order to the soldiers that they needed help. Marian replied that this was not important, and asked the lizard in surprise if he really thought that she would not have countermeasures. By countermeasures, the demoness meant the dome with which she covered the tree where she and the leaders were currently staying, and the guards did not have access to them. The demoness, sitting on a pile of elven guards, said that unfortunately she was a little different from that person, and by this she meant that she did not like sissies. The kings and queens silently accepted everything that the demoness was talking about now. Mariana was no longer in a playful mood. She took on an angry look and her eyes shone with a purple light and, saying that she would be frank, she asked directly where the power of the world tree was. Meanwhile, there was no longer a waiting crowd in the clearing, and the house was illuminated by the morning rays of the sun. Ken lay immobilized on the floor of his room, and a ray of light barely broke through the closed curtain of his window. The guy lay on the floor and heard Mai, without giving up hope, calling him, even though she was still pronouncing his name incorrectly. Mu called the man and asked if he would come out, trying to arouse his interest by preparing the most delicious food on this earth. And while Mu was shouting that if the guy doesn't try this delicious masterpiece, he will regret it later, the wolf watched her from the window. And even the leader, being a wild beast of prey, after seeing the bowl in the hands of Mu, doubted whether it was really food. Poor Kobold smelled a disgusting smell and, covering his nose with his hand, said in his own language that he refused to eat it, to which Mu, after translating it, told the dog that it was cruel of him. Ken lay silently on the floor, and was in such a terrible state that it was unclear whether he was alive or dead. Khan asked the house to turn on the lights because the room was too dark. The dwelling, like an obedient pet, immediately fulfilled the owner's request. Next, Ken asked to turn on the heater because he had been lying immobilized and cold for a long time. The temperature sensor beeped, and the number 32 was displayed. The last thing the guy asked was for the house to take him to his mother. But what the man expected did not happen. He did not teleport to his mother, but remained lying on the floor. The screensaver on the phone showed Ken and his mother posing for a photo. The guy covered his eyes with his hand, barely holding back tears, and asked the house to take him back. Mu and Kobold stood silently, waiting for the possibility that a person might now come down to them. The princess, sighing heavily, concluded that the guy could not be convinced even by such delicious food, to which the Kobold clearly reacted with understanding, looking at this disgusting potion in the bowl. Mu was saddened, but with the words that they can now eat it themselves, she already poured a full plate of incomprehensible liquid. And while Mu was devouring what she had prepared by both cheeks, the Kobold turned to the wolf, who was sitting in the middle of the room. The princess's meal was interrupted by a knock on the front door, and she, with her mouth full, was distracted to see who was there. Mew timidly opened the door only halfway, and looked out from behind it. In front of her stood a certain woman in a formal suit, covering her nose with a scarf, and with curled horns on her head. The princess, worried, asked the unfamiliar guest who she was. The stern woman through her scarf asked to excuse her, but she could no longer tolerate such a nauseating smell. Mu, looking at the woman, sincerely did not understand what she was talking about, so she asked again what she meant. Instead of answering, a tail of lightning appeared behind her back and sparkled brightly. The tail, like an arrow, rushed towards the entrance to the houses where Mu was still standing. The princess screamed and jumped away from the strange sparkling tail, which continued to burn its way inside the house. A wolf sat at the stairs waiting on Mu, and a kobold stood, while the corridor acquired a bright glow. To say that the chief and kobold were surprised is an understatement, but the radiance continued to rapidly approach. The kobold didn't have time to think of anything when suddenly the ground disappeared from under his feet. It was the wolf who rushed out of his seat, picked up the kobold in his arms, and jumped away from the sparkling tail. The tail, as if wanting to remove any obstacle in its path, pushed the wolf and kobold aside. The leader and kobold were lying on the floor and could not understand what it was and what was happening. The tail finally found what it wanted to eliminate immediately. The tail, with a slight movement, lifted the bowl of stinking liquid over the table as if with a hand. Imagine the surprise of the wolf and kobold again when a bowl of stinking food flew past them on an incomprehensible glowing thing. And then the bowl finally ended up on the street on the tail of this stern woman right above Mai's head. The lady, standing with her hands behind her back, threw the bowl into the air, and Mia continued to watch. And while the bowl was in flight, the woman adjusted her glasses as if she was taking a closer look at the disgusting liquid, after which she opened her mouth full of sharp teeth, and fire erupted from it, and clearly aimed at the bowl. Mu stood in a stupor looking at the stream of flame coming out of the mouth of this stern lady. The princess was ashamed that, as it turned out, it was her food that stank so much, and at the same time she completely did not understand who this lady was and what had just happened. The lady, continuing to cover her mouth and nose with a handkerchief, said through it that she simply could not allow the existence of such ugly creations. And in the house, meanwhile, the wolf and kobold were afraid not only to move, they were afraid even to move. Mia came to her senses after the fire show and looked angrily at the uninvited guest, clearly with a desire to tell her something. But the princess could only burst into tears. She felt so upset about her food. Someone's sudden movement stirred the grass, and the wind made it bend low and then continued to move, as if in a slow dance. Someone was moving through the forest with rather nimble and high jumps from one high ledge of the path to another. It was that same stranger with her animal. They looked out from behind a shelter in the forest and saw an elven tree. The stranger arrived just at the moment when, due to Mariana's forces, the elven guards fell to the ground and could not get up, and the girl wondered why they were dying. The guards lay on the ground trying to overcome the terrible pain, but the demonic force was powerful. The girl concluded from what she saw that the world tree had not blossomed and thought about whether these guys had taken the first step. The stranger, overcoming something inside, tried to overcome the force that manifested itself on her body with clenched fists. The girl remembered her sister Uni from a terrible vision when she was unconscious and told herself that she could not return in this form. The stranger prepared to jump by kneeling down on one knee and told herself that if she couldn't get the power to get rid of them. But her thoughts were interrupted because in the elven tree the power of the demoness was raging in full force, and she stood in front of the kings and queen, not believing what the lady had just said. Furious, Mariana glowed furiously with a purple light and asked the elf queen what she had just said. The lady elf paused for a moment and repeated in silence that the world tree was dead. The demoness became even more furious, which was evident from her gaze, and she asked the elf if she was offering to believe her in such nonsense. King Ritu was shocked by what he heard and repeated what the queen of the elves had said with only a question, and the king of men also asked what the queen meant. Marianne, like an angry animal, shouted to the queen why she was lying and asked everyone that they really wanted to say that they would not give up the tree just like that. The demoness bared her terrible sharp claws and screamed that in this case she would take the tree by force. The elf queen, in her reserved manner, raised the sacred scroll in her hand. Marianne noticed the queen's gesture and froze in place, waiting for what would happen next. The queen unfolded a scroll on which there was a burnt hole gaping right in the middle instead of a glowing image of a tree. The lady looked carefully at the demoness and asked that she knew what kind of scroll it was. In an instant, both the rage and the smile disappeared from Marianne's face, and in its place was silent misunderstanding and shock at the veracity of what had happened. King Ritu also could not stand it, and, pointing his finger at the scroll, could not believe what he saw. The Queen of the Elves made a conclusion, turning to Marianne, that, as she can see, someone burned the world tree. The King of Birds and King Dwayne stood next to each other, so both silently and sadly accepted this fact. And only Ritu, in whom emotions were raging, shouted that this was impossible, and that the tree would not have died so easily. The King of Birds decided to continue Ritu's assumption, and said that if he couldn't die so easily, then it means he might have been taken away. And Hyungnim, who has seen a lot in his time and being the wisest among all, continued with another assumption that this might even be fate. The King of People, trembling with his whole body, repeated to himself the same thing, that the world tree was dead. The man said that if the world tree is really dead, he fell silent, and abruptly moved away from everyone. The human king shouted to his guards to prepare to return to the castle immediately. There was no trace of the man, and the lizard king said after him that the king was a coward. The elf queen, turning away, paraphrased Ritu's words that a child might be scared after the death of a parent, because this world was born from a sacred tree. The queen listed, reminding everyone that the tree is the mother of all forests, and she gave birth to all the rivers and seas with dew along with every living creature. The King of People had already reached the guards when the queen finished explaining that people were the last ones to be born by the world tree. The King of People waved his hands in panic and told the other nobles what happened to the tree. After what the king said, everyone else was in a panic, waving their arms and holding their heads. The lady reminded everyone that they, too, would be deprived of the blessings of the sacred tree. The queen turned her gaze to the kings and concluded that when that time comes, they will be no different from people. The lady elf stood in front of the demoness and pointed out that everything that was said now concerns her as well. The demoness did not want to believe in the death of the tree, and was amazed that the queen had courage and not fear before her. Marianne shouted in the elf's face that everything was nonsense, and asked how she dared to deceive her. The demoness casually said that she didn't need blessings at all, but what she really needed was the power of the tree. Marianne screamed that everyone who was in front of her was an insignificant creature, and therefore could not feel the fact that she was emanating the aura of a tree from this hill. The demoness got angry again, pointing out that everyone was trying to take over the power of the tree. The elf queen repeated the demon's desire to gain power, but also recalled that they received a blessing from the two world trees. The lady continued to talk to Marianne about whether she was the same demon king who monopolized the eastern world tree. Then Ritu intervened with the words that this tree was also stolen, which took the demoness by surprise. Marianne screamed and rushed at the queen, throwing mud at her and directing her power at her. The queen did not even move from her place. Like a cold statue, she continued to stand motionless. The mistress repeated the question to the demoness about her desire to seize the power of the tree at the moment when Marianne's sharp claws stopped a couple of centimeters from the elf's eyes. The demoness, no matter how evil she was, did not expect the queen to stop her power. The queen again asked Marianne if she would like to meet with the one who owns the power of the tree. The Bird King and King Ritu were shocked by the queen's equanimity and coldness, and Hyungnim, still pretending to be smart, stood and talked about what he was now seeing in front of him. Kan, instead of lying down, was sitting on the floor of his room, but still as drooping as ever. The guy, as if feeling something for the first time in a long time, opened his eyes. There has been silence near the house for days now, and there are no battles or negotiations. It simply continues to exist. And although nothing was happening outside, inside you could hear the pleasant hissing of food in the frying pan, and the incredible smell of freshly prepared food wafted through. The wolf and kobold were already drooling and looking forward to their meal. Mu sat turning away from the men, sulky and dissatisfied, not paying attention to what was happening in the kitchen. As it turned out, the same unfamiliar lady with horns and in a strict suit began preparing the food, and judging by the appearance of Mu, she still has not forgiven the woman for burning the bowl of her food. The lady was using kitchen utensils with all her might as if it was a common thing for her. The woman deftly cut a juicy piece of raw meat with a wide knife. Mai turned to the woman and said that Mr. Gangnam's kitchen would break if she didn't use it carefully. The lady, without turning around, answered that the technology of mankind had developed quite subtly, and that she had never seen such tools turning food in frying pans at that moment. But having said that people remain people, the lady turned around sharply, adjusting her glasses, and added that it is not difficult to understand the mechanics of human inventions. Mu was seriously angry with the lady's words, and she couldn't answer anything. She just remembered how Ken shouted at her when the princess was preparing food and broke all the kitchen utensils. There was scattered meat seasoning on the table, and the lady, running her finger over it, asked what it was. Without waiting for an answer, she tasted the seasoning that was on her finger, and was surprised at how tasty it was, and that people had become so sophisticated, and concluded that she needed to be able to cook such good dishes. The lady took these seasonings and, pointing her finger towards the window, said that she would do something that garbage could not even compare with. The wolf drew attention to the window behind which the wind was blowing the remains of a bowl of stinking liquid, already in the form of ash. The leader and kobold simultaneously thought about Mu's cooking and remembered its sight and smell, and this made them feel uneasy. Mu stood up from the table in indignation and shouted that the lady's words were dishonest, and asked if her cooking was that much different. The woman defiantly and silently tossed the food in the frying pan, and it looked beautifully bright and juicy. No matter how much the wolf and kobold wanted to stick to Mu's side, they still agreed with the stranger. Although they didn't even say anything, they just lowered their heads. Everything around the lady suddenly darkened, and her eyes glowed with flame, and she told Mu in an eerie voice that such vile cooking methods as hers should be exterminated. The darkness suddenly disappeared, and the lady turned around and told the elf that she would forgive her for the opportunity to use this wonderful kitchen, and added that she was satisfied, and the kitchen behind her sparkled with cleanliness. Mu slammed her hand on the table and shouted why the lady thought she could say such things. The lady adjusted her glasses and began to answer the princess's question, but could not finish. Mu did not let the lady finish her thought, asking her what she meant. The woman continued to say, after Mu's reaction, that she was a passing chef. The lady, saying the food is ready, pointed to the table where the food lay appetizingly on the plates. The wolf and kobold were beside themselves with anticipation of such a delicious meal, while Mu defiantly showed indifference. The lady carried the plates to the table and wished everyone to enjoy their food, and indicated that she hoped that the guys would think about their actions. Halfway to the table with plates in her hands, the lady froze because she caught something like a signal or command, and the minute the woman received the signal, she disappeared, leaving behind only steam from the food. All three sitting at the table, although already terribly hungry, were surprised by the sudden disappearance of the lady. The wolf came to his feet and began to look for the lady throughout the room, and Kobold did the same, only standing on the table, and Mu, wanting to point out her dislike for this person, noticed that she left after teasing them with food, and this is cruel. The door to the guy's room was closed all this time, as if personifying his condition too. In Khan's hand was a phone with a message showing that the number he was calling was out of reach. The guy was lying on the floor in a dark room and holding the phone above him, making attempt after attempt to call. Khan, talking with the house, said that he most likely knows that he did not leave the house for several years after that time. Khan had memories of how he sat in his room at the computer day and night with black circles under his eyes and long hair, how he didn't want to go outside and didn't talk to anyone. The guy remembered how his mother always brought him food and called him to take a break from games and eat. Ken lay on the floor shedding tears and blaming himself for the fact that he did not deserve such treatment. He remembered how he finally opened the door to his room and looked out. The guy saw his mother fall asleep exhausted and fall asleep at the entrance to his room. Mom fell asleep sitting on the floor with her head in her lap, and their family photo lay next to her head. Ken looked at it then, and it was very difficult for him to hold back tears from the pain he felt. The guy went down to the plate of food and, being very hungry, began to greedily eat the food. Mom woke up and saw that her son had left the room and even started eating. Mom was very happy that Ken was eating, and she offered to warm up the food so that her son would not eat cold food. Ken, as if wild, looked at his mother with wide eyes, and she smiled back at him. From his mother's love, care, and kindness, the guy's eyes filled with large drops of tears. Ken ran back into the room, slamming the door loudly behind him, and Mom remained sitting on the floor. But the mother was still glad to see her son even in this condition, and so quickly. Ken lay further on the floor, telling the house about his condition then, and mentioned that his mother always talked to him even when she didn't see him. The guy again raised the phone above him, and said that now he is the only one who cannot talk to her. Ken could not hold the phone in his hand, most likely from weakness and cold, and it began to fall. The phone landed clearly on the guy's face, which made him feel terribly unpleasant. Ken put the phone aside and turned on his side, curling up in a ball and covering his face with his hands. The guy lay there for some time, curled up not so much from physical pain as from mental pain. Ken made an attempt and turned to himself with the words that he was a man and he could no longer keep his mother waiting. The guy gathered his strength and, taking his will into a fist, said that he could not lie around like this. Khan stood up and firmly stated that he would try again and decided to start by finding a way to control his power. The guy looked at his hand, which was already sparkling a little, and thought that if only he could find a way to adjust the power, but he stopped himself and realized that first he needed to apologize to everyone. Ken touched the wall in his room and said that after he dealt with what he had planned, he would find a way to return. The guy smiled and confidently told the house that he would return home together. Khan was a little alarmed by the fact that it was quite hot in the room, and he asked the house if it seemed to him. The guy told the house that he needed to lower the temperature a little, and then noticed that even through the closed window, it was quite bright outside. Ken pulled the curtain back from the window and looked down where some sparks were flying all the way to the window. The house was half on fire, which explained the too hot temperature in the house. Ken did not at all expect that, after such a long pause, he would see what was below the house. Near the demoness, who was waiting for the appearance of that same man, stood the dragon, who set the house on fire. Marianne knew that her methods were reliable, and was glad to see that once again they worked. The dragon, as if reading the owner's thoughts, opened its huge toothy mouth and formed a fireball there, directing it towards the house. Ken, watching everything that was happening now also behind the open dragon's mouth, which was ready to spew out fire, screamed hysterically, clutching his head, and not understanding what was in front of him. The guy leaned against the window and shouted to himself whether it was a dragon and asked himself, "It turns out that dragons are also real." The dragon, although it was deadly and creepy, moved the curves of its body very beautifully. Watching the movement of the monster from the window, Ken completely forgot about the danger and noticed for himself how cool the dragon is. Half of the window opened by itself in front of the guy, which caused the poor guy to panic, and he tried to return his thoughts to where the dragon came from. Due to the fact that the streams of flame were quite strong, and Ken was standing close to the window, he was thrown to the side. The demoness stood and watched this pitiful spectacle from below, and Ken tried to clear his throat, covering himself with his hands. Marianne casually turned to the guy asking if he was the thief who stole the power of her world tree. Kan, still covering himself with his hands, having heard what this unfamiliar person said to him, did not understand at all what she was talking about. The demoness was not going to stand on ceremony, and said that in this case he should be punished, and with a gesture of her hand she indicated to the dragon what to do. The dragon again opened its mouth for the order, forming a fireball in its depths. Kan, seeing the open mouth of the monster, immediately realized what was about to happen. The dragon released a stream of fire from its mouth directly towards the house, applying the strength of its entire body to it. The fiery blow hit where the front doors of the house were located,